We are live. All right. So welcome everybody to the first virtual firearm safety class that I've taught for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's weirdly not the first firearms class that I've taught in the last 6 weeks, but it is the first one that will be useful for your license to carry and or FID card inside the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Hopefully we'll be done in about, the shortest I've ever done this is about 2.5 hours. The longest is about 3.5. Depends on questions. Usually there's a live fire exercise at the end of it. We're obviously not going to do that. I do need to bring up my email invite so that I can read to you the exact words that I'm supposed to use. I am supposed to offer you live fire after the governor has cleared gatherings and some of the emergency order. That could be a while. One of the reasons why we're charging the $50 for this is we figure that if you do take advantage of the live fire afterwards, the only thing I'm going to ask is to maybe help defray some of the ammo costs. The class is usually $100 to $150 depending on the audience and the extent to which we go. So this will be useful in your application for a license to carry a firearm inside the Commonwealth, except for in certain jurisdictions, and we're not entirely sure which ones are going to be a pain in the ass about it, if you pardon my French. So there are some jurisdictions, Rick knows of at least one where if you don't have the live fire component associated with the class, because there are actually state certified classes that do not require live fire. Ours isn't one of them, but there is a state certified class or two that don't require live fire, that certain towns just simply say, no, you need to go to a range with an instructor and somebody needs to watch you not shoot yourself in the face.
Boston, I think, being one of them, and Rockland, the other that I'm aware of. I don't know of any others.
Rockland is the jurisdiction. Boston makes you go to the Moon Island range, so we'll talk about that when we do the introductions here in a moment.
Okay.
I got everything ready except for the list of things that I was supposed to say. One moment, please. Well,
I may have that.
If you have that in front of you, can you read from it for me?
Yeah, let me see.
He's another instructor. I'm not sure everybody heard that. He's watching to make sure that I do everything right. Also to help answer questions. And at some point after the pandemic is over, he may also be available to help arrange for online class.
I'm just running to see if I can find that so I can rattle it off. I hadn't planned on reading it.
No, I know. I should have had it up there. Well, welcome to Zoom.
I've got it.
You got it? All right. That's good.
Yes, I do. So this is what the Colonel of the State Police asked us to read at the beginning of this particular flavor of course, being the online course that's in place during the pandemic, and I'm going to read it verbatim. We are to instruct at the following. At the beginning of every course. A, this program is being taught online due to the current COVID-19 pandemic, the state of emergency in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the social guidelines instituted by Governor Baker. If you are taking this online program with another person in the same room, you should maintain a distance of 6 feet between all persons at all times. All other social guidelines regarding COVID-19 should be complied with during the duration of this program. Is everyone hearing this okay?
Yep.
Just double checking. Okay. If you don't hear it, tell me. If you can't hear me, don't speak up. C, that's crazy. C, because this program is live and interactive, you are encouraged to ask questions during the program. D, you do not need a firearm with you in order to take this program. As such, we request that you do not have firearms available to you while taking this program. E, the live fire portion of the program is not required for you to successfully complete the program. As such, the live fire portion of this program has been removed from the online version. You are welcome and encouraged to participate in the live fire portion of the program for free after the COVID-19 social distancing guidelines have been lifted for the state. You are also welcome to take the entire live version of the basic firearm safety program for free after the COVID-19 social distancing guidelines have been lifted for the state. And F, you are required to familiarize yourself and follow all applicable federal, state, and local laws regarding the possession and use of firearms. So that's what was written.
Yeah.
So
So
get everything. One last one.
Nope. Oh, you're not allowed to record it.
Yeah, not allowed to.
You're not allowed to record it. I am.
Right. Right.
You're not allowed
Exactly
to
right.
without my permission, because they don't want people to take then this recording and then hand it to somebody else, and suddenly they have got everything they need for the certificate, except for the instructor signing the certificate. So I think that's superfluous. So a few weeks ago, the state police sent out an email to all the firearms instructors say, you're not allowed to teach this class virtually, to which all of us said, we've never been allowed to teach this class virtually. What do you mean? And it turns out that was a precursor to this announcement where they're going to allow this for the duration of the emergency. I think they're trying to preempt a number of lawsuits by turning back. Oh, is that our last guy? It is. No? Where'd he go? Anyway, they're trying to preempt lawsuits and things like that. So they issued some guidance. They sent us these letters. They asked each instructor to apply. Many of us did. We got our letter within a couple of days of sending the email asking for permission. So I have the official okay from the state police, as does Rick. There's a couple other outfits in the Commonwealth that are doing it. We're the only ones that are teaching LTC 019, which I believe is peculiar to this particular group of people, given where we probably got your names from. So it took us a while to figure out, okay, what can we do and how can we make this sort of a useful and effective class? 90% of it was lecture anyway. So it actually turns out that it lends itself particularly well to it, so long as I have plenty of props and slides and audio visual so that I can demonstrate some of these things. What we won't be doing is some of the hands-on touching and feeling of prop firearms, which we usually do in advance of actually going to the range. So you're going to have to imagine it while we're doing this. Like Rick said, part of the guidance is we need to offer this to you again after the crisis is over. What we'll probably end up doing is having a range day. You guys will all have your certificates, so you won't necessarily actually be students anymore because you'll already have your certificates. But we'll invite you to a range day sometime after this is over and get you out to the range and make sure that you can safely and enjoyably handle firearms. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop letting you see my face because as everyone else, I need a haircut. I'm going to leave everybody unmuted. Remember that you are muted if you've muted yourself, so you'll need to unmute if you have a question. If you don't want to ask a question on audio, go ahead and type it into the chat, and I'll ask Rick to earn his keep, all of the no money that I'm paying him, to look at the chat periodically and see if we've missed any questions. So you can ask questions in the chat, you can ask questions live on the mic, and we'll go from there. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so the company is the England Safety Partners. The class is LTC 019, which is the Liberal Gun Club's basic firearm safety class. And what this is going to let you do is apply for a permit in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to own, to purchase, possess, and in some cases carry a firearm. So I usually like to start this with a walk around the room. How am I going to do this without gallery view? Walk around the room. I'm going to go ahead and stop presenting briefly so that I can walk down the list and just have everybody can just give me a, why are you doing this? Are you trying to get your permit? Is it general education? Is there a comfort level that's missing? If there's, anything that you're willing to share. And then while you're doing that, if you've actually used firearms before, ever, a little bit about that, right? So, some people, the last time they shot a firearm was a little 22 in Boy Scouts 30 years ago, something like that. So if you don't mind, if you're not comfortable, don't bother, and I'll skip you. But I'll go ahead and start with David.
Sure. So it's Colleen and David, and we're basically just getting more information. We've no real experience with firearms and looking to get more comfortable.
Kevin.
Yeah, so basically just looking to get my license, and I do have some experience in shooting at ranges with friends of mine.
Allison.
Sorry, I was on mute. Just general experience and looking to get my permit.
George. I'm sorry, Kevin. Hold on, wait a minute. It's moving people around in the list, so that's going to get confusing as well. George.
Hey, it's George. So yeah, I'm just interested in something I've been wanting to do more as a hobby, target practice and such. My only experience with guns was back in Boy Scouts. I was able to achieve, I think, a marksman merit badge.
You're one of those. Excellent.
Yeah.
Kevin.
I did go, but
Oh, you did. Then
Yep.
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
You keep moving around, so we don't need to hear from you again. Mel.
So I was licensed for CCW in Colorado, moved to Massachusetts about 3 years ago, so I'm just looking to renew my permit out here.
Of course, it's moved it again. If I don't get to you, I'm just going to say, hey, Joe, then Nick, because you guys are related.
Yeah, so I've been to the range a few times with my dad, and I'm hoping to get certified myself.
Nick, same thing.
I have a FID, but my FID is pretty much expired. I actually want to think it's expired by now, so I'm trying to kick it up to licensed carry.
Got it.
A lot of experience with guns, though.
Seth.
Hey, I'm looking to shoot for fun again, just be safer with it. I did carry a sidearm in the military, but it was a long time ago, and that was the Air Force, so I could use some refresher.
Spencer.
Hi, I'm Spencer. Yeah, I guess the last time I shot a gun was probably like a hunting rifle like 15 years ago as a small child with my father. So coming from a military family, I'm just interested in learning more and understanding guns a bit more because I have complicated feelings about them. And so I think the best way to deal with those feelings is to understand what I'm talking about. So that's why I'm here.
And that's an excellent reason. Did I miss anybody? Because the list was moving around. I think I missed Aaron. Did I miss Aaron?
Yeah, just looking to learn some more. No real experience with guns, so just here to learn.
Did I miss anybody else?
Yeah, this is the other Rick. Grew up around guns. My dad was a hunter, but I am one of those people who last shot at Boy Scout camp 30 some years ago. But you know, present situation had me thinking about what happens if the food system collapses, et cetera. And I decided I wanted or needed a firearm and realized for the last 2 months I would have been out of luck. And so I ought to get my ducks in a row.
Mass is a state where it requires you to have a permit to do anything, buy ammunition, buy firearms, possess firearms, and like I said, in some cases actually carry them. So one of those, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So those are all good reasons. I would encourage everybody when we're done with this class to, we're going to go through what the actual process is to make the application, but I would make the application and get the paperwork started. It's unclear whether or not towns are going to actually process them, but we'll see. Because even if you don't know, if you don't use it, you still have it. And then if something does happen where you do want to own a firearm, you don't have to wait. You can go right in, you show the little ID card. I'll show you mine. Oh, this is going to be fascinating. Put me on video permanently. I'm definitely not sharing this on YouTube. You'll get a little card. Nope, I got to turn the lighting down. You know, you get all this great lighting. Oh, and it's backwards, isn't it? Anyway, you get a card. It's got your picture on it. On the back, it's got your fingerprint. It's got your signature. You get registered in the Commonwealth's database. They'll give you a little piece of paper with something called a PIN on it, which is like your bank account PIN. And then that card and that PIN lets you walk into firearm stores inside the Commonwealth and purchase new firearms. You don't have to supply the PIN when you're purchasing ammunition, but you do have to show them the ID. So the card is necessary in order to exercise that particular right with any sort of speed and alacrity. The process itself is probably going to take about, well, God knows how long it's going to take this time. It usually takes about 60 days. I believe they're mandated by law now for it to not take more than 60 days or tell you why it's taking longer. But there's a couple of things. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen back, and we'll go ahead and get started with the program. If anybody needs a bio break or anything, holler. We'll give you a minute to wander off. Don't take the phone with you. And all right, now I got to move this ribbon out of the way. There we go. All right, I'm not going to go into presentation mode because I think that's irritating. So we've done our introductions. It sounds like probably about half of you, maybe 3/4 of you, have actually handled firearms before. Most of it's been a while ago, except for the one guy with the CCW from California. If there are firearms in the house, please make sure they're not in the room. I don't want to hear any bangs on the audio because I'll have to edit those out. No, I'm just kidding. Keep the firearms and the ammunition away from the screen while we're having this conversation. You shouldn't have a firearm in your home unless you're one of the park boys whose dad's got some firearms. So if you live with somebody, and I don't think we covered that, if you live with somebody who owns firearms, that's another great reason to pursue this permit because you're technically not allowed to touch them if you don't have the permit. So you've got to make sure that everybody in the house is permitted appropriately, so that even when you're following the appropriate storage guidance, you're not doing anything inadvertently felonious because you've left a firearm semi-unattended next to somebody who's not allowed to have it. So keep that in mind as you're going through it. Again, my name's Ed Gardner, which I'm not sure I actually said that, so I apologize. I have been a state police certified firearms instructor since 2010. They actually just sent me my renewal. And I'm the originator of LTC 019, which is the Liberal Gun Club's basic firearms safety class. So what we're going to see today is actually a set of slides that is better than the ones I usually use because it's got better pictures in it. So we had the club redo all the slides so the artifacts are prettier. They got better diagrams. There's some interactive stuff that will pop up on the screen, etc. So that's who I am. That's who you are. Did anybody here not come from the Liberal Gun Club's contact page? Park boys, you don't count because your dad.
I didn't, Ed. I came through you. I got your information from Eric.
Which is close enough because Eric's the training coordinator. So Eric's technically in charge of the program. Yeah, we're all licensed and trained, etc. So here's what we're going to do today. Obviously, we're not going to do this. We're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about the law. We're going to talk about the mechanics of firearms. We're going to talk about handling and marksmanship fundamentals. Talk a little bit about maintenance. And then if we have time at the end, we'll spend some time talking about organizations and statistics that may be friendly to the cause, as it were. But it's going to be a lot of me talking. And anytime you have a question, unmute yourself and say, I have a question. If you don't want to be on audio, and I think everybody has already been on audio, so I think that ship has sailed, put it in chat. And Rick, if you can pay attention to that periodically and let me know if there's questions or if I need to slow down, I'll do so.
I'm on it.
All right. So, safety. We've amended the rules of firearm safety. It used to be that there are these things called the 4 Cooper's rules, right? And the 4 Cooper's rules were always keep the barrel pointed, don't point the barrel at anything you don't want to destroy, keep your finger off the trigger till you're ready to shoot, be aware of your target and what's beyond it, and always treat the firearm as if it's loaded. We've reduced those to 3 fundamental rules that basically if you do these, you can't accidentally discharge the firearm. One of the reasons why we've removed it from the official curriculum for the all firearms are treat them all as if they're always loaded is that's clearly not the case. And I don't know if you can see on my video, but I know for a fact that this firearm is not loaded, well, because it's not real. It might actually have a magazine in it, but that magazine doesn't have ammunition in it. And there's also activities that you need to do where sometimes you're going to violate things that are in the rules because you're cleaning the firearm. You might need to put your finger on the trigger in order to actuate a particular mechanism in order to disassemble the firearm. You might actually need to look down the barrel to determine if there's an obstruction. But you want to treat them as if they have, they're weapons. They can be used to hurt or kill someone if you negligently use it. So these are our 3 rules that we like to keep in mind. You want to keep the barrel pointed in what's called a generally safe direction. You want to keep your finger off the trigger of the firearm and alongside the frame, so that's sort of a specific place where you want to put it, until you're ready to shoot. And you want to remember that it's something that if you don't treat it with care and caution, you can kill or injure somebody, yourself, a loved one, a pet, a bystander, etc. So we do want to treat these with utmost care and caution. Question, I'm going to put myself back on video and ask a question about safety. Let's go, so I try to put it over here. I've got 2 screens. I think that's probably, there we go. So what does a generally safe direction mean? A generally safe direction is sort of implying that you know if the bullet exits the barrel, where it's going to go. Generally safe direction is usually, when you're at a firing range, downrange. So for the purposes of this class, downrange is toward the camera, believe it or not, right? Because I know what's over there and I know what's behind over there, and that's generally safe. Other generally safe directions are sometimes pointed at the ground. A generally safe direction is almost never pointed straight up in the air. Everybody know why?
Come back down.
What comes up, what goes up must come down. Generally safe direction is almost never pointed up in the air, although there may be circumstances in which that's the only generally safe direction that you have available to you because of a large number of human beings might be around you. So generally safe is going to be situational and dependent on what's going on around you at the time. We'll get more into that as we talk about that safe handling, but barrel, downrange, barrel generally safe. Finger, off the trigger, next to, above the trigger usually. Many firearms have got a nice little divot right here where your finger will find a natural resting point. You never put it into the trigger well until you're ready to fire. And then the replacement for treatment is if it's always loaded is, this is well, if this were a real firearm, this is something that if you don't treat it with that respect and care and caution, somebody could get really hurt very badly or die. So that's our Debbie Downer for the afternoon. We're going to come back to that. Even while we're doing the props, you will probably, hopefully, if the camera's good enough, you will see that every time I pick up the gun, I'm always going to have what they call trigger discipline. So the finger's never going to be on the trigger until I'm ready to shoot, right? I'm ready to shoot, I'm ready to shoot, I'm ready to shoot. It's always going to be up here on the frame. That takes a lot of repetition when you're doing this work in order to train yourself to do that. The first thing these shooters do when they pick up a gun is they put their finger right in there because it's a really natural place for your finger to go. And it's intentionally designed that way. Slide. There they are. There are other rules for safety that you will encounter. Individual ranges have their own rules. Some of them can be quite draconian, especially here in the Commonwealth. Some of them are completely sensible. If you plan on competing, there will be an additional raft of rules. So Rick L, my Rick, I guess is how I'll refer to him for the course of the duration of this class, competes in bullseye events. And there's a whole raft of safety procedures associated with there. If you're competing in some of the defensive shooting classes, there's a whole nother set of rules that you have to care about that'll come with all their own jargon, like don't break the 180 rule and some other things. Individual ranges will have lines painted on the floor that say, when the light is flashing, you must make sure that the gun is over there on the counter and you're standing behind the line. Olympics require you to make sure that you know what the manual of arms is for your firearm or your air gun, depending on what kind of Olympics you're doing. All right, so there's almost always a user manual available for your firearm. So frequently, that's a good place to start with understanding it, right? So if that prop that I was just holding up there has a whole bunch of buttons and switches on it, only one of which makes the gun go boom. Everything else has a different function, right? You also want to wear eye and ear protection, and I'll show you what some of that looks like as we go through the class. You only have 2 eyes, and your hearing will only last as long as it lasts. And when you discharge firearms, they make a very loud noise and a very loud, bright light, and sometimes little pieces of metal come out of it. So you always want to have eye and ear protection. Sometimes bullets ricochet. Sometimes they fragment when they hit the target and bounce back. So it's always a good idea to have appropriate protective gear, regardless of what the exercise is. But with firearms, it's safety glasses or appropriate eyeglasses that have polycarbonate frames, not glass, will sometimes suffice. And then ear protection, which means either earplugs or over those ears, like construction ear protection that you might have when you're on the construction site. And I can make sure that by the time the class is over, you guys have information on where to find some of that gear. You're always going to want to wear appropriate clothing suitable for the range. Open-toed shoes are generally a no-no. Low-cut shirts are generally a no-no. You're usually going to want to wear a baseball cap because, and this is going to get interesting if I've got to flip back and forth between the video. If you look up where I am, if you scroll there should be a gallery view of the video and where you can see me, and I can show some of this. Spent brass comes out of the top or the side of the firearm, especially in semi-automatic firearms, and that brass is hot. And if that brass goes down an article of clothing, you end up doing a dance that ends up being very dangerous unless you've got very good control over where your hand is and where you've put that gun. So you want to wear clothing that's appropriate. Build hats, buttoned up shirts. Try not to wear open-toed shoes because hot brass on your toes sucks too. You're going to always want to have an appropriate way to inspect your firearm, make sure that it is in safe operating condition. You're going to want to make sure that there's a safe backstop. You don't want to shoot at a lake. Bullets bounce off of water. We'll show you, or like I said, I'll try to show you a standard procedure for passing firearms from one human being to the next. You want to clean your firearms. Clean firearms are reliable firearms. And after you're done shooting, you're going to wash your hands and your face. Because when you discharge a firearm, a big cloud of nasty chemicals comes out of it. And that rests on your clothes, it rests on your hands. And the last thing you want to do is eat a ham sandwich right after shooting. So you're going to want to wash your hands, blow your nose. It doesn't matter if it's cold or warm water. We used to tell them that it did. Apparently the chemistry doesn't quite bear out there. But you want to wash your hands with good soap, wash your nose and your face with good soaps, and then you can go to the restaurant and have your ham sandwich. We're going to talk a little bit about secure firearm storage, but that is going to be a safety tip, or actually it's a rule here in the Commonwealth. You have to secure your firearms when you're not using them. And you never want to be using drugs or alcohol while handling a firearm, because just like any other piece of heavy machinery, used negligently, you can kill or injure someone. Questions about that? All right. As I mentioned, so there's another safety concern here that is non-trivial. If you shoot regularly, and by regularly, like once a week, you want to, regardless of actually how often you shoot it, but especially if you shoot regularly, you want to worry a little bit about lead contamination. The way that the bullets are manufactured is this. Where'd it go? We'll go over the anatomy of a round here in a second. This orange piece is usually made of lead. It might be coated in brass, or I'm sorry, in copper, or some other jacketing material. The primers that actually make the bullet explode are also have a strong lead component. So lead contamination is a real thing, and you want to be careful of it. So that's why we're telling people, the good thing to do is wash your hands. Right? It gets vaporized during ignition. It's always in indoor ranges that have poor air handling. Well, basically leave them. If you can't hear the air handlers turned on when you're in the indoor range, leave. That means that they're probably not taking care of the machinery, and you're running a risk of making yourself sick. Lead exposure is something that real competition shooters get checked once a year, but they shoot an awful lot more than most of the rest of us. If you're shooting about once a week, every once in a while you want to ask your doctor about your lead. They're rare, but they exist. So we think that lead contamination is something you should care about a great deal. You can see here on the slides, it still says wash your hands and face in cold water after shooting. And as far as I know now, it doesn't matter if it's warm or cold. The thing that matters is, much like with the pandemic, use soap and wash them appropriately. Questions about lead? Obviously, we're not actually all in the same room, so some of these things really don't matter. No loaded firearms in the classroom, no live ammo in the classroom. I'm going to violate that rule exactly once because I'm going to show you how to load a gun. If we were actually handling props and stuff would matter, I'm going to skip this. So for now, you're going to see me point the gun at the screen. You might actually see me point the gun here. You might see me point the gun behind me. I'm going to really try very hard not to point it at my own face. These props mostly are inert though. So I'll make sure I tell you what kind of prop I'm using so that you guys can have some comfort as well. And I am going to show you a standard procedure to pass the firearms. We're obviously not going to get to practice that. I'll just explain it. Basically it is when you have the gun, you unload the gun, you lock what they call the action open, which you guys don't know what that is yet, or if you do, great. And then you set the gun down with the barrel pointed downrange, and then you step away. And the next person can come and pick that gun up. And that'll be the standard procedure that you do that. That's the best way to hand off the gun at a range. If you're out, if I'm out with you, and we're doing the live fire portion of this class, hopefully eventually, that's how I'm going to do it. Unless there's a very specific set of actions that need to be taken, in which case then I'll warn you that we're going to deviate it only for this exercise. But in general, the gun gets unloaded, made safe, and then set down so that the next person can come and pick it up. And before they even pick it up, and you can't really see this, I think I'll grab a phone and use that as a second video source. You can inspect a gun that's action open with the ejection port facing the sky. You can actually look at the firearm and determine whether or not it's loaded. I will do that. I will log in with a phone because that's going to be important. We'll get to that in a second too. On there. Any questions so far? Pretty straightforward stuff. All right, it's logging in now. Let me log in. We get somebody just join? So we're going to keep coming back to the safety. When we go over the actual firearms operation, we talk about, the parts of the firearm, what's the business end. And we'll talk about that generally safe direction. We'll talk about where the trigger guard is. We'll talk about safeties that there may be on a firearm, manual safeties or integral safeties, et cetera. Okay, good, I'm in. Oh, that's me. Why didn't somebody tell me that was me joining? I'm going to pin. Did that go? Pin video. All right, I'll figure that out in a minute.
Ed, this is Rick. I was just going to make a comment if that's okay.
Go for it.
As I noticed when you were showing the cartridge that you held up, that was a snap cap and not an actual live round.
That was indeed. And we'll talk about, actually, we'll talk a whole bunch more about the rounds because I'll use these things called snap caps, which are pretend ammunition, useful in a couple of ways. Why is this not letting? There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, so let me show you this spotlight video. Stop the share. All right. So this is that prop firearm that I showed. The magazine is out. You can actually, if you're at the range and somebody does this, you can come over here. You can look down there. And if my laptop wasn't in the way, you could look up the magazine and you can visually inspect this firearm to see that there isn't a round, there we go, there isn't a round in the chamber and the gun is empty and safe. And that will be the process that we'll use at the actual range in the event that we ever get to see people again. And share. like I said, we'll come back to safety. Now we're going to spend an awful lot of time talking about the law. It's one of the requirements of a class in the Commonwealth is to spend time talking about law. We're going to walk it all the way from the federal level down to here in the Commonwealth. My standard disclaimer is I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. I do know a lot. And one of the things that we hope you're going to walk away with when you're done with this class is if you decide to carry a firearm on a regular basis, you're going to know at least one lawyer too. So this is not legal advice. You've got to figure this out for yourself. You've got to figure out all the appropriate federal and state laws that you need to abide by on your travels. I'm going to give you an overview of what I know to be true, or at least I understand to be true, rather. And I'm going to tell you what I think is also true inside the Commonwealth, which, as far as I know, and Rick is going to correct me if I make any mistakes, is still true today. But I can't stress this enough. If you're going to end up with a firearms license and you're going to carry a firearm, you want to have a lawyer on speed dial. Because God forbid you ever use it, you're going to need that lawyer. So we start at the top. All firearms law, quote unquote, flows from the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, subject to all sorts of rules lawyering, we call it, on the internet, and all sorts of interpretations. The only real interpretations that we're going to care about are the things that the actual Supreme Court has stated and the things that the Commonwealth currently enforces. But all of that then provides the groundwork for the federal laws that we talk about. We've got a couple of agencies that we need to care about. It's no longer called this. I think they've gone back to just being called the ATF. It used to be the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. Now I think they're just the ATF. I think everything else has gone over to Treasury. The ATF is now part of DHS. It all got alphabet souped after 9/11, so it got very confusing to follow. But the ATF are the guys and gals who are responsible for regulating the sale of firearms in the United States and the possession of firearms that are prohibited, right? So they're responsible for the regulations around that. Interestingly, they're not always responsible for the enforcement. We'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the ATF's principal responsibilities these days is regulating what we call FFLs, which are the federal firearms licensees. These are the licensed gun shops. These are the shops that you go to. If you're here in Massachusetts, there's one in Woburn called Four Seasons. There's Mass Firearms down in, I forgot what the name of the town is. There's a fair number of actual firearm shops in the Commonwealth. They all have federal firearms licenses in addition to additional licenses they need to get from the state. The ATF is the one responsible for vetting that. The ATF comes into their shops periodically and makes sure that they're keeping their inventory locked. They come into their shops and they audit their books. We'll talk about the background checks and things like that in a minute. What the ATF is not responsible for doing is doing things like running the background checks. That's actually the FBI. So the ATF is the federal agency. It used to be attached to the Department of Treasury. It used to be the people that were enforcing the cigarette stamps on your cigarettes. They still do tax stamps. A tax stamp is required to get a short-barreled rifle or a suppressor or even God forbid, an actual machine gun. They're the agency responsible for regulating all that. And they're mostly regulating the commerce of it and the violations in that commerce. There's another sort of thing that you're going to hear a lot about. There is, as of, I want to say, and it looks like they removed the slide from that. I'm going to skip some of that because I don't want to talk about that. We're going to get back to the 4473 in a second. A whole bunch of gun control laws have been based on the events that politicians wanted to control, and a fair number of them have been, well, outright racist, right? So in the 1850s, before the Civil War, slaves were prohibited from owning firearms. In the 70s, there's a very famous picture of the Black Panthers on the steps of the California Capitol. Reagan enacted the Mulford Act and some other things that created some very fairly draconian firearms laws in the state of California. There's an awful lot of stuff that comes out of a lot of the laws we're going to talk about come out of events in history that are responses to violence of some sort. So most of our laws came from responding to an actual event that happened. For instance, the National Firearms Act of 1934. Since 1934, owning a machine gun has been a regulated activity. You have to pay the ATF, the federal government, a fee. I believe it's still $200, so it's not a very huge fee, but a fee, and register and jump through a bunch of hoops in order to be able to own a machine gun. That was part of the National Firearms Act in 1934. It was an almost direct response to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So it's one of the few things that actually wasn't outright because people of color were doing things. It was a really horrific event in the 30s related to the rise of the gangster in American lore in the early 30s. Regulates machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, suppressors, otherwise known as silencers, destructive devices, grenades, and things that they call any other weapon that doesn't easily fall into a specific category. In order to own any of these things, or actually in order to own machine guns, short barrel rifles, or shotguns, or suppressors, you need special permission from the ATF. You'll frequently hear that referred to as a tax stamp. All machine guns became registered after 1934. So the federal government had a registry of all of the actual machine guns. We'll actually talk about what the difference is between a machine gun and, say, an assault weapon in a little bit. So that was 1934. 1968. Can anybody tell me what was going on in 1968? Didn't think this would be a history class, did you?
Vietnam.
1968. So we were doing things in South Asia we probably shouldn't have been. We had a fair amount of civil rights unrest. You know, college students were throwing rocks at National Guardsmen and eventually getting shot for their trouble. A lot of things were going on in 1968. That picture of the Black Panthers on the steps of the California State Capitol, I think was from '67. I'd have to actually look at the date. But that made a whole bunch of people stop, take notice, and say, maybe there ought to be a law. So it was the first time they sort of enacted sort of broader firearms regulations. Before that, the only thing that was really enforced was the NFA. And that was really just enforcing, you know, hey, if you want to own a machine gun, you can't just buy a Thompson gun off the Sears website. You have to register with the federal government. And at the time, $200 was an awful lot of money. So they thought that it would dissuade, you know, your average guy or a gal from going out and buying a Tommy gun. Now in 1968, they do some additional things. They established for the first time what's the notion of the federal firearms licensee, the store, the person engaged in the commerce of selling guns is an FFL. And then they established some rules for commerce between the states. Most of those rules are still in effect today. Some of them are even more dramatically enforced. You can buy a rifle. I can go up to New Hampshire, buy a rifle, bring it back to Massachusetts, so long as I then follow the rules in Massachusetts. But pistols, I gotta buy it and have it shipped to an FFL here. So they've established some rules for interstate commerce. And then they did for the first time, and we'll see if anybody can figure out why in a moment, categories of what they call prohibited persons. Let's see if this next slide talks about prohibited persons. Let's go back up to 4473. For the first time, they established this notion of what a prohibited person was. They didn't codify this until later, and we'll talk about when that was. But one of the things that is on here is an unlawful user of controlled substances. Controlled substances in 1968 were, and still to this day in some states, things like marijuana, etc. It was sort of a back channel thing to, hey, I don't like seeing all these guys sitting on the steps of the California Capitol, so we're going to make it harder for them to own guns. But this notion of prohibited persons didn't get codified until I believe the next thing. But it's stuff like under indictment for a crime, but it had to have a prison term of greater than 1 year. So a crime that was, 11 months or less, not a big deal. Convicted felons, and that could be felonies for check writing fraud or anything like that. Fugitives from justice, It's interesting on the form, they're asking you if you fall into these categories. And part of the reason that they do that is if they find out later that you lied, that's another charge that they throw at you when they arrest you. You lied on your federal form, because lying on the 4473 is also a felony. Are you under the age of 21 for handguns, under the age of 18 for long guns? Have you been adjudicated mentally defective? That means the judge has gavelled down and said, you need to go to an institution and you're no longer fit to sort of take care of yourself. Have you been dishonorably discharged from the military? Have you been convicted of the crime of domestic violence? We'll get to what that means in a second because it's weird. Have you ever renounced your U.S. citizenship? And are you an undocumented or non-immigrant alien? So H-1B holders aren't allowed, and undocumented immigrants aren't allowed to legally possess firearms, own firearms in the United States. But that GCA 68 was where we first got the notion of those general categories of prohibited people. And prohibited means that you're not allowed to own a firearm. You're not allowed to go into a gun store and buy a firearm. In 1986, they cleaned some of that language up, right? So it amends the Gun Control Act of 68, which amends the NFA of 34. It did some positive things for firearms ownership. There were some abuses of the ATF, whatever it was called at the time, prosecuting FFLs that weren't, say, politically favored, and some other things. They increased the sort of clarity around safe passage between states. After 1968, driving from one part of the country to another part of the country with a firearm was very complicated. It's a little less complicated now, not a lot, but a little, so that it provided for safe passage for personal transport of firearms and ammunition across state lines. Talks about things like you requiring them to be unloaded and locked unless you're a permit holder in that state. Ammunition should be locked up separately. There's some things about carrying them on a highway that becomes a felony unless you're otherwise allowed. And then clarified some of those prohibited persons list, which resulted in that new list that I showed you at the beginning of it. So that list has basically been enforced without modification since 1986, with one small exception. Also in 1986 was when they decided that machine guns weren't allowed for normal people ever. And a machine gun, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the sort of the mechanics of firearms, a machine gun is when you press the trigger on the machine gun, it fires more than one bullet. So the rat-a-tat-tat-tat from the movies, those are machine guns. If every time you press the trigger, it only fires one bullet, that is not a machine gun. But in 1986, it is illegal from there on forward for civilians to own new machine guns manufactured after that date. So that's sort of the joke with the firearms folks, right? So when people say machine guns, they don't really mean them, one, and two, they've been illegal since 1986. You cannot buy a new machine gun unless you're a policeman, well, pretty much unless you're a policeman. Police can buy them and the military can buy them. Regular people cannot buy new machine guns. If it was made before 1986, you can buy a machine gun, but it's going to cost you anywhere between $5 and $25 and maybe $100,000 depending on the machine gun. So it basically turned it into this really big collector's market. Towns in Massachusetts will give you licenses. We'll talk about that. There's actually a machine gun license you can get, so that if you are somebody with that kind of disposable income, you can collect those sorts of items. But that Hughes Amendment was 1986, made it illegal for civilians to own machine guns manufactured after that date. May 19th, looks like. Then we had the Brady Bill in 1993, which required a background check for all purchases from a gun store. Initially, it had a 5-day waiting period. That 5-day waiting period was only in place until they computerized the background check system. And then the 5-day waiting period was waived because it was quote unquote instant, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. That is maintained and run by the FBI, and the FBI is responsible for investigating issues in and around it. So if you are a prohibited person, you go to buy a gun and you get flagged in the NICS, the FBI is supposed to come and do something about it. 1994, we had the omnibus crime bill, etc., which was affiliated with the assault weapons ban. that expired in 2004 federally, but in Massachusetts was put into law permanently in 98 by then Governor Romney, which established categories of certain semi-automatic rifles and pistols, and some by name that are no longer allowed to be sold, that were no longer allowed to be sold in the United States. It also established a notion, which has been adopted by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, of a large capacity feeding device. The large capacity feeding device is, if you, I don't know if you can see my video, I'll show it to you in a moment. Again, is the magazine, the thing that goes, the thing that people frequently call a clip. We'll talk about that in a second too. That goes into the gun that has all the bullets in it. It's a little spring-loaded device that feeds one bullet after another. Every time the semi-automatic gun cycles, it loads a new round in the chamber, and you can fire it again. So it banned large capacity feeding devices. So the great big banana magazines on the bottom of your AK-47s and AR. This is, by the way, not a real magazine. If you can see the video, this is a prop magazine, but they look like this. So the stuff that you see in the movies and on TV with the guys putting these big magazines in the bottoms of their ARs or their AK-47s or whatever they're carrying, those were banned from 1994 to 2004. And I believe it was in 1998 is when they were banned here in Massachusetts permanently. And then again, certain firearms by name. So an AK-47 by name is a banned firearm. A Bushmaster XM15, which is an AR-15 variant, we'll talk about that, is a banned firearm. The M16 or the M4 are not allowed to be sold as such. Now, of course, firearms manufacturers got around that over the course of the preceding 10 years by renaming the guns. So the ban by name wasn't a big deal for them because they just renamed the SKUs. The efficacy of that notwithstanding, we can talk about that. Some other things that are relevant to us are Supreme Court decisions. Two that are particularly relevant. So prior to 2008, actually prior to 2010 really, there were maybe about 20 states in the union that you had to go through some significant hoops in order to own a firearm. Specifically, the District of Columbia, since it's its own little world, had an outright ban on handguns. That was struck down in 2008 by this thing called DC versus Heller. It was written by the court that it is not something that a municipality certainly can regulate, and established it as quote unquote an individual right. So all the hand-wringing about what the clauses mean in the Second Amendment notwithstanding, the Supreme Court says this is what we think it means, and therefore this is the law. So they established it as an individual right. 2 years later, or actually it was not quite 2 years later, there was another court case. Since DC is weird, right? DC is not a state, it's not a territory, it's the District of Columbia. There was no case law, and people were sort of arguing back and forth on, well, what does that mean for states? Because Chicago had a ban, an outright ban on almost everything inside the city limits. That was struck down in 2010 by McDonald versus Chicago. And the key takeaway from that is it can't be overridden by state or municipal laws. So DC versus Heller says it's an individual right. And then the states say, well, yeah, but we can still regulate it. McDonald versus Chicago said, well, yeah, you can still regulate it, but you can't ban them. So you can't make them go away entirely, but you can have a lot to say about what sorts of firearms people can have. And that was one of the things that kind of got lost in translation in the McDonald versus Chicago thing. There have been a couple other things since, but they're not nearly as sort of seminal to the understanding of how our Supreme Court interprets the body of federal law, the United States Constitution, in the context of firearms ownership. This is a really, really, really old screenshot of the Massachusetts website. One of the things Massachusetts has done pretty darn well is put a lot of stuff online. So now the website is actually navigable and you can find stuff. Everything you need to know about Massachusetts firearms law is actually available on the Massachusetts website. EOPS, EOPSS, Executive Office of Public Safety, and I don't remember what the other S stands for. Basically, it's the agency, the overseeing umbrella executive agency that manages the state police. They're the ones in charge of firearms regulation inside Massachusetts. They're the ones that are ultimately approving your licenses. They're the ones that are looking into gun shops and abuses there. The Attorney General has oversight as well. There is an NRA chapter, which is not something I like to remind people, called GOAL, G-O-A-L. They have on their website a fairly decent, actually probably the best summary of what the Massachusetts gun laws actually mean for specific cases and instances. So online is a great place in Massachusetts to go and find out specifics. If you have a very specific question and I don't answer it in this class, there's resources online that you go to and have a look at. Until about oh God, I keep forgetting when this was, 2012, I think, we had a whole bunch of different firearms licenses in Massachusetts. It used to be that you needed a special firearms license to carry pepper spray. You don't need that anymore, so that's gone. We still have the FID, which I believe Nick said he had, but he let expire. The FID, otherwise known as the Class C license, allows for the possession, purchase of non-large capacity rifles and shotguns. Non-large capacity rifles and shotguns. That basically means double barrel shotguns and bolt action rifles. And we'll talk about what those look like in a second too. Then they got rid of the LTC Class B because it was stupid. They left the LTC Class A, which is, I think they're probably going to eventually not take away the Class A part of that. That's the license that everybody gets, right? The only people who get FIDs, well, actually, we can talk about that in a second. The LTC Class A is you could buy any firearm that's legal in Massachusetts, and that's an important distinction because there is a list of guns that you're allowed to buy new in Massachusetts that's maintained by the Attorney General. But if it's on that list, you can go in a gun store if you've got an LTCA and buy it. It's also the only license in this list, even though there are fewer now, that allows you to carry a firearm concealed. If you're out hunting, you can carry your rifle and obviously to hunt. You know, if you're dressed in camo with some blaze orange vests and you got your rifle, you're allowed to be out in the field as long as you have an FID. For the carry the firearm in any other context, you need the LTC Class A. This class is on the approved roster for getting your LTC Class A. We'll talk about some of the vagaries of that. And then there's a Class E license, which is a separate license for collecting some NFA restricted items. We are not allowed to own suppressors. We haven't been since at least '98, and that's unlikely to ever change. But certain towns will approve a Class E machine gun license for you. I think Lincoln's one of them. Some of the other rural towns are. Boston's not. Newton's not. Some of the inside. It's basically inside 95. No, outside 95. Maybe. So those are the licenses that we're going to be pursuing. Everybody who's taking this class, when they're done with this, and I explain what the process is, should pick up the phone, call their local police department, see if they're processing applications, and 2, pursue an LTCA, because that gives you the greatest flexibility and the greatest benefit from having benefit back to you in terms of what you can and can't buy. You need one of these, the C or the A, period, to go into a store and buy ammunition. So, questions about the licenses? All right. Well, holler if you do. So large capacity has this very specific definition under Massachusetts law. And it's a little pedantic, and there's a little bit of jargon, so if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to explain all of the words. A weapon is large capacity if it is a semi-automatic handgun or a semi-automatic rifle, and that means that you don't need to do anything between trigger presses in order for it to fire the next shot, and we'll go over that in detail in the next section, that is capable of accepting or readily modifiable to accept any detachable large capacity feeding device. So remember when I talked about feeding devices a little while ago, this is where it comes into play in Massachusetts law. It's that detachable magazine, the magazine that comes out of the gun. That is a detachable magazine. I'll show that to you on video more in a few minutes. Any detachable large capacity feeding device that holds more than 10 rounds or is capable of being modified to hold more than 10 rounds, and we'll talk about that too in a second. Or if it's a semi-automatic shotgun, capable of accepting more than 5 shotgun shells, or if it is a named assault weapon. So what does that mean? So shotguns, everybody's familiar with the classic pump action shotgun. I've got a prop here that I can show you, if not, where in order to fire the gun between each thing, you have to rack it, and then you can fire it. That's a pump action shotgun. That is not a semi-automatic shotgun. We will talk in detail about what the different actions are. So a pump action shotgun that can take 8, 10, 12 shotgun shells is not a large capacity gun, and is, you can have an FID and own it. So any pump action shotgun. Bolt action shotguns. If anybody see the movie 1917, I'll show you one in a minute if you haven't. Where you have to maneuver a piece of metal on the gun in order to load the next round. Can have as many rounds in the chamber, as many rounds in the magazine, detachable or not, as you want. Does everybody know what an M1 Garand is? World War II rifle.
Yep. No.
Yeah.
No.
So they had what's called a fixed magazine, where you shoved ammunition in from the top to load the spring-loaded magazine that would feed the bullets as you were firing it. That's a fixed magazine. That is not a large capacity weapon. There's a couple of categories of them that we can talk about. I might be able to show you some depending on how much time we have, where, just because it can hold more than 10 rounds doesn't automatically make it large capacity, doesn't automatically make it assault weapon, doesn't automatically make it subject to some of the extra rules. It's the removal of the magazine. Like I said, when we get to the props, I'll show you some of that in detail. But sometimes cops, when they're doing your interview, and there's going to be an interview process when you get your license, like to ask you questions. This is a question that I like to ask. What does large capacity mean? So wouldn't hurt to commit this to memory. So what's not large capacity? Pump action shotguns holding more than 5 rounds, bolt action, pump action, lever action, or, and I've never seen one, slide action firearms. And then certain 22 caliber rifles, which are the little plinkers that you might have used in Boy Scout, with tubular magazines. It's an integrated magazine, so it's not a removable magazine, but you can get, I've got one that holds 18 rounds. That's not a large capacity weapon. And again, some of this I think should become clearer when we do some of the props. The application process is the same, whether it's a license to carry or an FID. Again, these are very old screenshots. I need to get them updated, but you go out to the Commonwealth EOPS website and you download the application. I'll take this a step further. You should go to the town you live in. And that's something I probably should have done at the start of it. Does anybody on the call live in Boston?
Yes.
Yes, no?
Yeah, in Brighton.
So you're going to be special. We'll talk about you in a minute. You want to go out to your city's website. They usually have their own branded forms on the website. They're supposed to take the ones from the state, but sometimes they add a question or two and they really want you to fill out theirs. So you're going to go out to your city's website. You're going to look for the firearms licensing section and you're going to download their application. But if you want to see what's in it, you go out to the state website right now while we're on the call and download the application and have a look. It's relatively short. It asks a lot of the same questions that are on the 4473, and we'll get to that in a second. And you fill that application out. You give your town, you take the application in, they fingerprint you, you give them $100. They make you wait until your fingerprints come back to make sure you're not a crook, and then they send you on your way, and that's the start of the licensing process. Massachusetts has what's called suitability requirements, which are slightly different from the prohibited persons requirements. So if you're not 21 or older, you cannot get an LTC. You are stuck with an FID. If you're 15 and you have your guardian's permission, you can still get an FID. That means you can go hunting with your dad and your mom. You cannot be a convicted felon. That's similar to the feds. You can never be convicted of any drug offense. This is the way Massachusetts has interpreted the habitual user of prohibited substances, right? If you've been convicted of it, then you must be habitual. And that means any drug offense. I'm not going to make anybody raise their hand or even go on audio and say yes, but this means misdemeanor marijuana convictions. There's a road that you will have to follow in order to get a firearms license. You cannot have ever been convicted of any crime, not just violent crimes, any crime that had more than 1 year of incarceration as its minimum sentence. So it's not just a, hey, you know, the judge gavelled down, I punched this guy in college, the judge gavelled down and said, time served, you can go home, don't do it again. The crime still had a minimum sentence of 2 years, therefore you would be prohibited. You can't be a youthful offender convicted of a felony or of more than, I should say, of more than 2 years incarceration. The Massachusetts licensing requirements are the only ones that I'm aware of in the Commonwealth where they're allowed to look at sealed records. So Grand Theft Auto, I think, has got like an 18-month sentence. No, it might have a 2-year sentence. There are certain categories of felonies that will automatically make you prohibited. So if you were 16 and you did a dumb thing, you're going to want to make sure your record's clean and you're going to want to talk to a lawyer. Again, if anybody's got this particular circumstance, I can give you the name of a lawyer. It's a long, hard, almost impossible road. You can never have been confined to a mental institution. So in the federal laws, it's adjudicated, right? So even if you voluntarily showed up to a mental institution, but then they kept you there and they confined you there through whatever machinations might have happened, you may end up being prohibitively determined to be unsuitable by the Commonwealth. Another thing where in Massachusetts is unusual, this is one of the few places where they do an in-depth Department of Mental Health evaluation. They're not actually asking you any questions, but they're diving into records that are otherwise nobody's business. You can't be under treatment for any drug or alcohol addiction. I think it's drug or alcohol. I know it's at least drug. You can't be under treatment. So if you decided to go to the clinic and dry out, you're under treatment and you're thereby considered unsuitable. You cannot be under any current charges or under an active arrest warrant. And as last time I checked with a lawyer, this means bench warrants from stupid places that maybe you had a parking ticket and you didn't show up for it, and the judge gavelled down and issued a bench warrant. Any warrant, doesn't matter. Can't be under current charges or under any arrest warrant. This is also one of the few places where Massachusetts is actually able to reach out to other states and ask them questions about people's records. So the guy that killed all the motorcyclists up in New Hampshire, if he were applying for a firearms license, they would have probably seen that because they pay an awful lot of attention to this interstate, across the country background check, not just to whatever their own little world is. You can't be under a current restraining order, which is a little broader than the federal laws. So if you're under a restraining order or any sort of other protective order where you're supposed to stay away from somebody, doesn't matter if it's domestic violence or not, you're not allowed to own a firearm or you're determined to be unsuitable. But it has to be, I believe, a current restraining order. And then the garbage collector is you can never have had your LTC revoked or denied. And if you're unsuitable or you forgot something, you know, hey, I did something dumb when I was a kid and I forgot about it and it was on my record, and you don't know about it or you don't remember it, or you don't tell the police, and they do the background check and they find out it's there, they're just going to deny you your permit. They might actually arrest you. That makes you permanently unsuitable in the Commonwealth. And then if you ever do anything dumb, get arrested for almost anything really, you may have your LTC revoked, in which case that may put you back on a long road of trying to get it back, because once it's been revoked, they're probably not going to renew it, especially if it was revoked by the same town that you live in. So the suitability requirements are a little broader than the federal prohibited person requirements. Again, if anybody thinks that they might fall under any of these, you can let me know in some other way, and I can put you in touch with a lawyer to give you a readout on whether or not it's going to be a problem. Medical marijuana cards count for federal law. That's the one place where they have amended the federal law, or not the law, but the interpretation of law in the forms. Medical marijuana users are technically prohibited by the federal government, and then by extension prohibited by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts from owning firearms. I've not heard of anybody having that enforced on them in Massachusetts. because I think the state police may have thrown up their hands on the subject. But if you had a medical marijuana card, well, until recently you didn't need it. Now it's probably, these are not compatible things. These are two cards that can't be in your wallet at the same time. How do you get your license? Everybody need a break? Are we good?
I'm good.
All right, I'll keep going. I'm going to give you like, what is it? Like the 5-second rule. If I drop something on the floor, if I don't hear anything, I'm just going to keep going. Steps getting your license. So the first thing you do is you need to take a state-approved firearm safety class. That's this. And again, with the current pandemic, we're going to have to be, we're all going to be in this together to figure out what, if a town is even processing applications. So it might be worth a phone call after the class to your local police department and say, how are you dealing with firearms licenses? You're going to want to make that call anyway, because you're going to want to see if there are any special requirements that they have. And there are still some towns with special requirements, Boston being the most notable. If they have their own form, you'll want to go to the town website, download their version of the form and fill it out. When you call the local police department, you want to call and say, I want to speak to the firearms licensing officer. So in Massachusetts, firearms licensing suitability determination is given to the local law enforcement authority, usually the town that you live in, and some rural areas, it's going to be the county sheriff. A firearms licensing officer is usually not the actual chief of police, even though that's the name. It's the chief of police or their designate in the statute. It's a detective or a sergeant or somebody who either really likes the idea of helping people, or really hates the idea of helping people, or has been volunteered for it and then nobody wants to do it. But you want to talk to the licensing officer. You want to say that you completed your basic firearms safety class and you need to make an appointment to submit your application. And this is a good time to ask, are you taking appointments? Because it's unclear if anybody's actually processing applications. You want to ask whoever that person is what else you will need to do besides the application, your check for $100, and the course certificate that I'll give you when we're done here. If there's anything else the town requires. They've been known to ask for cover letters. Why do you want a gun? They've been known to ask for letters of reference. You know, sometimes those letters of reference have to be from other people that live in the same town. Sometimes they don't need to be. So this is an opportunity to find out exactly what you need. Sometimes, and this is really, really uncommon, but sometimes they still even ask you to belong to a range. It's unclear whether or not that's legal to ask anymore, but that may still be a thing that they say. And if so, then there's a circular argument that some ranges won't let you join them unless you have an LTC and blah, 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 blah. So we can conquer that. If you have trouble, I'm happy to answer questions offline after class, after you've had the phone call. When you go to your appointment, if you're allowed to go to your appointment, they're going to fingerprint you and photograph you. For two reasons. One, that'll eventually be used on your license. Two, they're going to run your prints. So you're going to have an immediate Corey run. Corey is the Massachusetts background check. It comes back in a couple of minutes while you're sitting there. I think this is primarily to say, wait a minute, no, we should arrest you right now. But while you're sitting there, they'll run the Corey, and then they may or may not ask you to speak to the chief, the licensing officer, or the designate. In Newton, I never saw the detective until the very last step. Everything else was through the admin for the detective unit. Boston is special. So, and I've forgotten already who said it was they live in Brighton. You will need to pass a qualification test. And there's a very specific course of fire, and I will make sure that you're prepared for it. But they take you out to Moon Island. You have to use these ancient 38 caliber 4-inch revolvers. And you have to hit a pie plate, and you have to hit it with a certain number of shots before they will allow you to proceed in the application process. But that is a requirement for Boston. I don't believe anyone else has a range test, although certain of the jurisdictions, as Rick mentioned earlier, do require that your class have a live fire component, and not all classes do. And obviously this class won't have one until after the pandemic. Once you've done all that, a whole bunch of stuff starts to happen. First of all, each town has their own sort of, in that same omnibus that struck down some of the additional licenses in the, that are available, they also clarified some things and made other things muddier. So the chief of police is the ultimate arbiter of your fate in this process. He's the one that ultimately determines whether you're suitable. He or she determines whether you're suitable. That could include his designate, right? So he basically gives it to that detective or that sergeant or whatever, and then that person makes a determination on whether you're suitable. And they may or may not put a restriction on your license. Just because it says LTC, license to carry, doesn't mean it's an unrestricted license to carry. Sometimes they will put restrictions on your license arbitrarily. It's now at least a small set of certain types of restrictions. So for employment purposes, so if you work as a security guard, or if you own a convenience store and you need a gun because you want to have a gun in the store in case somebody comes and robs you. So for employment purposes is one restriction they could put on it. For target shooting, like I want to be a competitive shooter, or I just want to go to the range and plink, they might put target shooting only on your license. I've now forgotten what the other restrictions are. For hunting, etc. Right? So they've reduced it to like 4 or 5 restrictions. It used to be whatever the chief wanted to put on the card. So it could have been, only on the 3rd Tuesday of every 5th February. I'm only kind of exaggerating because it was really arbitrary. Whatever the restriction they wanted on it, they could put on it. Only on weekends was a restriction that I think actually got on a card at one point. Now it's got to be restricted to a handful of actual legitimate restrictions: employment, target shooting, hunting, that sort of thing. They may put a restriction on it, and that depends on the town you live in. Boston, never, almost never, probably never, I hate to say never, but pretty much never, gives unrestricted licenses. The unrestricted license is the only license that allows you to put a handgun in a holster, underneath your shirt, on your hip, period. Everything else, if there's a restriction on it, you're restricted to carrying that firearm to and from the designated activity. So different towns do different things. As I mentioned, different towns may use different application forms. They're all supposed to have the same common elements, but they might add 1 or 2 things. The thing you want to go for is the LTCA, no restrictions. We just talked about that. There's a lot of stuff that sort of goes in behind the scenes on what they can do to you. We'll talk about what they're actually going to look into in a second. How can you lose your permit? Don't get arrested, period. Don't get a restraining order, period. If you get arrested or you get a restraining order, they're going to come probably take your guns. They might throw a couple of more charges at you when they take your guns because maybe you didn't lock them all up the way you're supposed to. We'll talk about that so you don't get in that kind of trouble. And if you move, you have to tell the town that you're moving to that you have a license. And then you have to tell the Firearms Record Bureau that you've changed your address. And then when you get your renewal in that new town, all bets are off on whether or not they'll honor the same, either non-restricted or the same restrictions. So when you move, you have to fill out a form, you have to tell people, and things might change. After you do all that, and you go through that process of sitting down, possibly with the chief at first, a whole bunch of things start to happen. So you give all that paperwork and the money. It's no longer 40 days, it's 60 days now, I believe, to the state or to the police department. They're going to enter all your stuff into the MERC system, which is the Massachusetts, I don't remember what all the letters stand for, but it's basically where all this process starts.
Mass Instant Record Check System.
Thank you. The police department submits queries to the Department of Mental Health to see if you've ever been confined somewhere. They submit your fingerprint query to the APHIS database, which is the federal fingerprint database, to look for you doing bad things outside of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It used to be that they send the fingerprints by mail. Some of that's been automated now, and renewals are now emailed. Anyway, so they send it to the feds. They ask for your sealed records, if there are any, and somebody might go pull microfilm, if you've ever seen microfilm. They run DMV checks. They run all sorts of other checks on you while you're waiting. They wait for the response from the Massachusetts State Police that you aren't disqualified for some reason. Again, ignore all these timing on this because it's all these numbers are gone. They wait for the response from the DMH. Then they take all that crap that they sent, and however long it takes for them to get back, it used to be 3 or 4 weeks. I'm sorry, 4 or 5 weeks rather. They wait for all that stuff to come back. They look over the whole file. They review all the responses. They make a determination on your suitability. He looked at me funny when he walked in. Isn't a good reason. They click approve if they find you suitable in the Merck's system, and that sends it over to the state police. And then the state police do it all over again. They basically check the PD's work. So that's why it takes like 60 days or so. If the state police come back and say they did everything right and do all the confirmation stuff that they need to do, they print out that card that I showed you at the beginning of class. They mail it to, not you, the police department. And then the police department may call you and tell you it's time to come in. I usually recommend people start calling the police department about 45 days into the process. Again, with the pandemic, all bets are off, no idea. To say, are we there yet? You know, don't be too annoying, but make sure that you're persistent because they don't, many towns simply don't care. They will not be proactive. They will not call you. So you call them, you come in, they do this one final, hey, are you sure you want this? You might, again, talk to the chief or the firearms licensing officer for some more formal interviewing. I have not actually heard of a police department ever mailing them to you. They hand them to you then and there with a piece of paper with your pin on it. And then you've got a license and you can go out and buy a gun. Used to take 50, 60 days. No idea what it's going to take now. Questions around that process before we move on? So they check you out, and then they check you out again, and then they have you come in and make sure that you're sure that you want this license. Once you have the license, then you go out and buy a gun. All right, so when we started this class, I said, I hope there aren't any guns in the room. I really hope there aren't any guns in the room because if you don't have a license, you're not supposed to have one. It's only after you get the license that you can have the gun. There are approved equipment rosters. So gun stores are only allowed to sell you certain kinds of firearms. And until, God, Rick, what was it, year and a half ago when Healy did the assault weapons redo?
Oh yeah, it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's almost 2 years ago now, I think. It's currently being litigated. There used to be 2 lists. The AG had a list, state police had a list. And gun stores kind of guessed which list was the appropriate list. The AG maintains a list based on safety testing and some other things. The state police had a different list. Glock's on one list, Glock's not on the other. Now, currently, there's some litigation where basically everybody's following the AG's list and the state police list is completely ignored. But there is an approved roster. There are certain kinds of firearms you cannot buy in Massachusetts. There's certain kind of firearms that you can bring into Massachusetts if you've moved from elsewhere and then sell on a private sale, but you can't go into a gun store like Four Seasons and buy a brand new Glock 19. You have to buy it used from a cop or from an ex-cop. Many manufacturers make handguns that have mass-specific requirements enacted. And I won't be able to show this to you because I'd have to get a real gun out. But they have things like you should be able to tell if there's a round in the chamber of a semi-automatic gun. There's a little lever that pops up that says that's the loaded chamber indicator. They have to have 10-pound trigger pulls for double action handguns and other things. So there's things, they have to be able to survive a drop test after a particular number of things without discharging. So the Massachusetts Attorney General's got this list ostensibly for safety where manufacturers must meet it, and if they don't, they can't sell the gun new here in the Commonwealth. If it's new and interesting, you probably can't get it here. We also have other equipment restrictions. Post-ban assault rifles. So assault rifles are semi-automatic rifles with large capacity feeding devices. They can't have bayonet lugs, so military surplus ones. They can't have flash suppressors, not sound suppressors, flash suppressors. That's a particular device that goes on the end of the barrel that reduces the muzzle flash from a rifle. They can't have a threaded barrel. A threaded barrel is something that's used to attach a removable device to the end of the gun, usually a sound suppressor. And they can't have a collapsible stock. Let me show you what that means, because I have an example. All right. So this is a replica of an AR-15 that has a collapsible stock. That's what it means, adjustable. If this were a real firearm, this would be an illegal assault weapon in the Commonwealth. Excuse me. Other things, there might be a device on the end of here that would suppress the muzzle flash. There might be a, this is actually, I don't know if you can see that, that's actually a replica bayonet lug. So if this were a real gun, this would be completely illegal in the Commonwealth. It's not. Interesting fact, I don't own AR-15s. Back to the slides.
Hey, Ed, this is Mel. I got a couple questions.
Sure.
Having moved here from Colorado and purchased my firearms in Colorado, and they're currently in storage with my daughter in Oklahoma, what are the restrictions as far as like bringing those weapons into Massachusetts with unlicensed?
I'm not a lawyer. The restrictions are, you were supposed to bring them, if they were legal in the state, you could have brought them with you when you moved here.
Okay.
If they're rifles
they're
not assault weapons, you can bring them here, and then we'll talk about the registration thing, right? Actually, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute in detail. If they're handguns, I believe the law is pretty clear. You have to have them shipped to an FFL and transferred to you.
Okay.
It depends on how long ago you moved here. Don't put it on audio. I don't want to record it.
Sure.
It might be a good question to ask one of the lawyers that I can give you a name of. I know folks have in the past done things where, oh yeah, I just moved here. I went back, I got my stuff, and then I brought them here. There's a registration requirement in Massachusetts that we'll go over here in a second.
Okay, thank you.
They can't be a named assault weapon. They can't have any of these features that we just talked about. They can't have magazines made after 1998 that hold more than 10 rounds. You can still, through the way the law was written, there is a quote-unquote loophole which allows you to possess large capacity magazines of greater than 10 rounds if they were manufactured and in the state prior to 1998. Of course, most magazines that were manufactured and in the state prior to 1998 aren't serialized. You have no idea. What will get you in trouble is if you have one for a gun that didn't exist in 1998, then they'll know that you have a you do not have a pre-buy magazine. So in general, I avoid pre-buy magazines except for on clearly collectible guns or range toys. Concealed carry firearms, stick with the letter of the rule as well as the intent of the rule, and keep nothing but 10 round magazines. You're generally allowed to modify your guns after you buy them, and you're generally allowed to assemble them so long as you follow all the other rules. So that means you can have a gunsmith take that 10-pound trigger down to a 5-pound trigger. The poundage on triggers, how much force it takes for you to actuate it, and really heavy triggers are hard to actuate, and somebody's got paper in front of them.
Oh, so sorry, that's me. I'm trying to look up something about, I'll mute up. I was trying to look up something about out-of-state transfer of exempt firearms, because you can, if you're from out of state, you do have a time period with which you can bring firearms in. I'm not sure how that works if they've been in storage for a while, but that's worth pursuing.
Yeah, it's like 60 days. So, but we can take that offline, and I can make sure that you have appropriate legal advice on that. So anyway, you can generally you can go out, buy a unfinished lower assembly for any handgun that has them, and build your own gun. That's still legal, but you still have to follow all the other rules. You got to do the registration and things like that. And you can build an AR-15, but you can't build one that becomes an assault weapon. So some things to watch out for. But you are allowed to maintain your own firearms. You are allowed to have gunsmiths do stuff to them.
I just had a quick question. I've heard about pinned magazines. What's the mass legality on that?
Uh, as far as I know, that makes it a fixed magazine. That makes it fine, so long as it's a gray area. So I know in California they pin them. Um, if it's nobody, there's not really any magazine police, so nobody's going to come and say is that welded in place or not. In general, avoid them, right? And certainly don't use them in a defensive firearm. I don't have any pin magazines. The only large capacity devices that I have that hold more than 10 rounds are pre-bam, and I only use them for range work.
Okay, thank you.
There are certain kinds of guns that you can't get 10-round magazines for that are older. Like there's a Czechoslovakian police gun called the CZ82 that only has 12-round magazines. All right, so we did the equipment restrictions. For some reason, there's 2 slides for that. Yeah, so pin magazines that's a weird gray area. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give you any advice on that. I generally avoid things, especially if you're going to carry defensively. Massachusetts also has a strict requirement for safe storage. Safe storage means it has to be locked, either with a trigger lock, a cable lock like that picture, or in a safe. The other safe storage is under your direct control. The only definition of under your direct control is basically on your body. So in a holster, on a belt, on your hip. If you are carrying it in a purse or in a, what's that thing you put around your waist when you're riding a bike? I've now forgotten. A belly sack of some sort. As long as it's on your body, then it's in your control.
Fanny pack.
Yeah, thank you, fanny pack. As soon as you take that off and set it down, it's no longer under your direct control. I had one guy tell me he got stopped by the police. The gun was in an unlocked case on his passenger seat, and the cop basically took the gun away. And he had to fight to get it back because it wasn't under his direct control and it wasn't locked. So trigger locked, cable locked, in a safe, or under your direct control. The safes come in many flavors. We also have a requirement, it's got to be under your direct control or in that lock because it's your responsibility as a firearms owner in Massachusetts to prevent unauthorized users from accessing the firearm. Unauthorized users include children, although they'll give you they'll throw an extra charge at you when they arrest you if children can access it. So it's your job to keep it locked up or keep it on your body. Safes come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, and flavors, and you can spend an awful lot of money on it. It doesn't have to be an expensive safe or even an expensive lock container for it to be mass legal. It can be these this middle piece right here. These are pressed steel, pressed metal frames that you can basically break open with a lock. The lock is the important component. It's like locking your car door or locking your house door. You're not trying to prevent the concerted thief from doing it. You're preventing sort of that casual unauthorized access. Gotta have a lock. There are some great quick access safes out there if anybody's interested in talking about defensive shooting and staging defensive firearms. And then there's obviously the much larger, let's devote an entire room of the house to this type safe where you can store entire collections. But they have to be locked. So you'll notice the stuff on the wall behind me. These are black powder replicas and they're not considered firearms. So I'm allowed to have them on the wall and unlocked. Just for grins though, all of the pistols have trigger locks on them. But that's the only exemption to this must store firearms locked rule is when they're not quote unquote real firearms. We can talk a little bit about that more too. When you're transporting the firearms, there's a couple of things. One, there's transport between states and whatnot, and then there's also transport while you're driving around Massachusetts. So, in Massachusetts, when you're transporting firearms, rifles must always be unloaded and locked away from the driver's ability to access. So, in the trunk or in the back compartment of the SUV. Handguns can be carried so long as they're under your direct control and you possess an LTCA unrestricted. Otherwise, they got to be in a locked container, they got to be out of your control, and the ammunition must be stored separately. When you're driving across the country, you're supposedly protected by the Firearms Owners Protection Act, which was part of the 86 law. So long as you store them appropriately, unloaded and locked, or in the trunk, That's an interesting distinction. Or in the trunk, because the feds think that the trunk is a sufficiently locked container. Massachusetts doesn't seem to. I would lock them up anyway. Don't press your luck. With the ammunition locked up in a separate container. Basically, they don't want you driving across country with a readily accessible firearm and a box of ammo that you can just shove in the gun and make it go. The reality of transporting firearms is more complicated. Again, I told you about a former colleague of mine who got pulled over, lost his gun because it was in the passenger seat, unlocked, even though he had an LTC. I believe it was even an LTCA unrestricted, but it was no longer in his direct control. So it wasn't locked and he got in trouble. And then there are states like New York and New Jersey where if you drive through them with a firearm, I don't necessarily recommend that. I'd talk to a lawyer though if you're really keen on doing it. If you drive through them with a firearm and you get pulled over and they have any reason to believe that they should search your car, you're going to jail. And then they'll figure out whether it was legal to arrest you later. New York, New Jersey are like that. There's a couple other southern states. God forbid you drive while you're not white. In some other places, driving with a firearm across state lines, read each and every state that you're going through. There's plenty of resources online I can give you. Read what their laws are. Some states you have to tell them, yes, I have a gun. It's over there. Some states, they don't want you to tell them, and it really depends. Like Ohio, you get pulled over in Ohio, and you happen to have a license that's honored in Ohio, you're required to put your hands at 10 and 2. Officer, I am armed. My handgun is here. What would you like me to do? All right, so there's all sorts of rules everywhere else. We do not have an obligation in Massachusetts to tell the policeman that we are armed, although they know, because it comes up on their screen. When they run your plates in the back and they run your license in the back, they say, they'll also see whether or not you have an FID. Every once in a while, a clever cop will say, carrying your gun today, son? So be mindful, right? That they know, but you don't have to tell them. I'm not going to get into whether or not it's appropriate to hand them your driver's license plus your LTC at the same time. There's a school of thought among certain firearms instructors that that's quote unquote polite. It's not necessary. If it's not necessary, I don't do it. That's what I do. Yeah, so basically, unless you have an LTCA and unrestricted, the only gun that you can have that's loaded and on your person is that pistol. Everything else is in a locked container somewhere else in the car or truck. Questions about that? Got a handful more slides on the law, then I'm going to take a very quick bio break, get a glass of water because I talk too much. Purchasing. You got your license. You know how to safely get things to and from. You know where you're allowed to carry it, where you're not, and we'll talk actually a little more about that as well. Buying a gun. Two types of transfers. Actually, there's more than two. There's only two common types of transfers. Buying a gun from a store, buying that from the FFL. It has to be it has to be on the roster for you to buy it new from the gun store, or it has to be papered, which means that there has to be a bill of sale that's been coming along with this gun for its entire life that proves it was in the state prior to, like I said, I think it's 98. So papered pre-roster firearms. I once had a two-shot Cowboy Derringer, didn't have the paper for it, couldn't put it on consignment in a gun store because it wasn't papered, even though it was clearly made in like 1978. For every sale, oh, and then private transfers are the other way. So you and I can get together once you have your license. I can sell you a gun. I'm only allowed to sell, I think it's one per month. So that sort of prohibits me from getting into the business of being a gun store.
It's 4 per year.
4 per year, yes. Once for every 3 months now, isn't it? So four per year. Anything more than that, and the state thinks that I've engaged in the sale and sort of as a business, and that's a no-no. So I can sell you a gun. Rick can sell you a gun. Any other licensed firearm, any other licensee can sell you a gun privately. Regardless of whether or not it's purchased in a gun store or sold from me to you, it has to be a transfer form has to be filled out. And this is where we get to that firearms registration I was talking about when you asked the question about the guns that were currently out of state. Every firearm that comes into the state, every firearm that transacts between human beings, whether they're stores or individuals, needs to have what's called an FA-10 filled out. The FA-10 details who's selling the gun, who's buying the gun, and then the details around the gun. You know, how long is the barrel? What manufacturer is it? What color is it? What caliber is it? Is it a large capacity gun? Is it an antique? Is it this? Is that the other thing? There's a laundry list of questions they ask you about the gun, including things like the serial number. And then that gets submitted. It's all now done all electronically. So you do this even when you're a private seller. You bring your laptop or your iPad with you. You type all this information in. You have to look at the other person's license. You have to put your PIN in. And basically they do a quick check. Is the license still valid? And if the license is still valid, they take you to the next screen. If the license isn't valid, they don't let you proceed to the transfer screen. So in Massachusetts, we have a de facto per sale, if you're doing it legally, background check, because they're checking on the status of your license. But you have to have one in order to make the transfer. So I can't give a gun to my friend in California without taking it to a gun store, transferring it officially to the gun store, as far as Massachusetts is concerned. Then they have a facility to send it to California, and then he has to do whatever he has to do on his side of it. So that FA-10 happens for every firearm. And they have recently allowed you to actually ask the Firearms Record Bureau to give you a list of the guns that they think you own. But they have a list of the guns that they think you own. And you've got 10 days, I think it's 10 days from the sale. So if I sell a gun to you, I basically have to do the paperwork right away. If you bring a rifle in, a non-prohibited rifle in from out of state, go to New Hampshire, and you have there's a store, I'm not going to answer, why is my phone ringing? I'll turn that off, sorry about that. If you buy a rifle out of state or from a collector, you still have to register it. So you can technically go to adjacent states if they'll sell it to you. If it's legal to sell it to you there, they can sell you a rifle as long as it's not an assault weapon and with all the other stuff that we talked about earlier. And then you bring it into the state, and then you sit down at your computer and you bring up the EFA-10 form and you fill it out and you just leave the seller information blank. All the pistols have got to come through FFLs. So that's the official legal way of getting firearms that aren't currently in the Commonwealth from outside the Commonwealth, unless you just moved here, in which case you technically have 60 days to get your permit, and it's unclear whether or not you're supposed to register those firearms. Okay, it's not unclear. You're supposed to register those firearms. It seems like over the years, almost nobody who's moved here actually goes through the trouble of registering their firearms. So that's another question that would be great for a lawyer if you've got something that might be questionable. There's your 60-day window. You can keep your non-approved equipment so long as it's not assault weapons. And again, Boston's weird. We just talked about that. Anything there? Yes, it's got to be legal both in where you're buying it from and where you're moving to, right? Here's the thing that might be relevant to the question that was asked earlier. I mean, there is a family transfer capability on the FA-10 form. And again, it's like, that's probably a better question for the lawyers. Like, if it's been more than 60 days, what's the best way to do it? They're going to tell you, go through the FFL and have them done that, which is going to, depending on how many guns you're talking about, could be an expensive proposition because most FFLs charge $25 for the transfer. You can ship firearms. Now, you're technically allowed to ship firearms for supposedly through the USPS, but you can't actually take a firearm into a post office because that's a violation of a different rule. So when people ship firearms, like shipping back to the manufacturer, they're almost always doing UPS or FedEx. The United States Postal Service doesn't want guns in the mail unless I think they're from the CMP because they've got some sort of weird exemption. So UPS or FedEx. It depends on the store whether or not they'll freak out, whether or not you have to tell them. As long as you're shipping it to someone that's allowed to get it, as long as it's being shipped back to you and you're allowed to receive it in that way, certain repairs and manufacturers are allowed. But the safest way to ship a firearm is take it to a gun store. I have had folks that have shipped them to themselves. So, hey, I'm going to go to Colorado and go hunting or whatever. I'm going to ship it to myself, care of the Marriott, pick it up there, take it out hunting, and then ship it back. That's less savory to me for a number of reasons, because I'd rather actually have it in the checked luggage. You can travel with firearms unloaded in locked containers, but you need to check with your airline on if there are any specific other rules. So you can ship them. It gets real sketchy real quick. I try to avoid shipping them unless the law is extremely clear for whatever the case is. Last time I had a gun serviced, I took it down to the FFL. They shipped it to Ruger. Ruger fixed it. They shipped it back. The gun store didn't charge me a dime, other than the $30. No, actually, Ruger even covered the shipping. So gun stores are your best bet when you're transporting them in any way that is not completely and 100% clear to you. Take them to the FFL. Let's see. We've got one more slide about the law, and then we're going to take a quick break. Any questions so far? All right. Massachusetts does have, if you've ever heard the word castle law, it's not the thing that people are allowed to shoot first and ask questions later. Castle law is based on my home is my castle, that kind of thing, where you are protected in some ways from criminal liability for discharging your firearm into a bad guy inside your home. It's only inside your home. If you're doing it to prevent your television from being stolen, chances are real good that you're not going to win. And the person that you shot or their family can still sue you. So castle law it's really limited. That's the MGL section that I believe still exists. There is no provision for any self-defense for anyone outside the home. So if you choose to get a firearm for your own personal protection and then you choose to carry it, you are not protected in any way, shape, or form from criminal or civil liability if you use that firearm outside your home. If you're going to do that, this is the, again, reminder, get a lawyer, get them on speed dial, make sure you have that information handy. There are even some quasi-insurance programs out there that help pay legal fees in the event that you are legally, otherwise legally using your firearm in self-defense. So choosing to carry a gun outside the home for the purpose of the defense is a challenging thing. It's something you need to sort of think about carefully. There are other ways to defend yourself. Those might be better suited for your lifestyle. That's the law. Now we're going to actually, what time is it? Now we're actually going to talk about guns after I take a quick break. So does anybody have any questions before I step away for a moment?
Nope.
All right, I'll be right back. 2 minutes, tops. Then we're going to talk about guns, finally. And soda. You guys aren't even talking to each other. All right. I got my Coca-Cola.
Hey, Ed. Ed, Rick here. Yeah, I think everyone took the bio break very seriously. I ran off for a second.
Excellent.
There's a couple of things that on the Attorney General versus the EOPS. I think the Attorney General.
Actually, we'll wait for at least most of them to give positive confirmation that they're back.
All right.
I'm back.
Well, that's one.
I'm here.
I'm here.
I am here.
It's 4.
Yeah.
5. I mean, it's really, actually, I probably should have.
I'm here.
There we go. It's 6.
I'm also here.
7. That's close. All right.
This is Bernard. We're back.
Outstanding. That's 8 and 9. I think that's critical mass. So if folks come back,
Thank you.
folks come back in, and I got to go back. We'll go back because some of it's we'll be going back and forth. All right. So I got slides for this, but I also have props. I want to talk a little bit about the actual guns. Finally, I told you it was going to be safety in the law, and then you're going to be tired of hearing me talk. Firearms, a couple different kinds. Actually, there's probably a slightly larger list than this, but these are the typical categories that things fall into. We got rifles, we got shotguns, we got handguns. Rifles. Actually, let me do that. Rifles are designed. Showed you this prop earlier. Rifles are designed to be shouldered. They're designed in general for two-handed operation. Let me scroll that down, right? Where, you're propping it back into your shoulder, you're taking your support hand and you're putting it some appropriate place on the foregrip, and then you're operating the firearm. A rifle is a two-handed weapon designed to be shouldered. It usually has what they call a rifled barrel, which is where the word rifle comes from. A rifled barrel means that it's got spiral grooves bored into the inside of the barrel that imparts spin on the fire on the bullet as it exits the barrel. Rifles can be they usually fire a single projectile, although sometimes they fire multiple in succession. So certain kinds of machine guns can be rifles. They are also frequently referred to as long guns. Shotguns are also typically designed to be fired from the shoulder, although there are some examples. Again, this is another replica, right? You can tell it's a replica by the orange tip. Designed with a smooth bore. So inside the barrel, it's smooth. And they may fire a single projectile or multiple projectiles. And what the heck did I do with the prop shell? It's here somewhere. Shotgun shell looks like that. That contain a single lead projectile or contain a number of individual small projectiles that as the trigger is actuated, the powder charge in the shotgun goes off, it fires those multiple projectors downrange. But they are smooth barrels on the inside. These are also typically called long guns because they are designed to be shouldered, right? And in some cases, they have to be shouldered because they're very painful to shoot otherwise. Handguns can be, they're held in the hand. This is a replica handgun, right? Designed to be held in the hand. There is no supporting infrastructure associated with the gun that lets you stabilize it. Your body is ending up being the rest of that supporting infrastructure. So on the rifle, you've got that stock that comes back and stabilizes it on your shoulder. On your pistols, that's your arm. And we'll talk about shooting stance and things like that in a minute. They can be revolvers or semi-automatic pistols. This is a replica semi-automatic pistol. This is a replica revolver. right? And we'll talk about the pieces, parts of these in a minute. Handguns are typically lighter, they're smaller, they're easier to quote unquote carry, they're definitely easier to conceal. They typically have a shorter effective range and are often considered less accurate than their long gun counterparts. So rule of thumb, pistols are good out to about 50 feet. Rifles are good out to, well, depends on the rifle. Some rifles are good out to a couple of miles, 100, 200 yards. Your typical rifle that you might buy in the store, either an AR-15 or something like that, you know, you're not shooting those at more than 100, 200, maybe 250 yards, unless you're really into the sport, in which case that's a whole different ball of wax. So rifles, shotguns, and handguns. We're going to concentrate an awful lot on the handguns in this class because it is an LTC class. But here are some examples of what rifles look like. Right, rifles, anything. They can have wood stocks. They can have. Oh, actually, I'm not projecting, am I? So you can't see that picture. So we saw the black rifle, which is the AR-15 wannabe, and then we have. Let's get back to the slides. Other examples here. Bolt action rifles. That means that there's a physical piece of metal that's attached to the thing that makes the gun go boom that you have to lift up and pull back. That's this bolt right here. It can be semi-automatic with either fixed magazines, and I'm not sure that's actually a fixed magazine variant right there because it looks like it's removable. But as we talked about when we talked about the M1, sometimes these magazines are actually embedded in the rifle and you can't remove them. There's no little button on the gun that lets you take the magazine out. It's literally fixed into the rifle. Those wouldn't be large capacity if they are indeed fixed magazine rifles. Old Soviet or Chinese SKS, old service rifles like that are fixed magazine. M1 Garand is a fixed magazine. The Springfield, the World War I Springfield A1s are fixed magazines. Certain early model Lee Enfields is fixed magazine. There are a number of modern hunting rifles that have fixed magazines. As long as there isn't a button that lets you take that feeding device out, that's a fixed magazine rifle. Or they can actually have detachable magazines like the AR-15 example that I just showed, or any number of others. There's a picture of the M1 Garand. That's the lower picture here. This is what that World War I rifle is there is no detachable magazine here. It's built into the gun. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you know, the soldiers would take these unblocked clips, which are basically just a handy container to hold 8 rounds, and shove it in the top of the gun, and then release the bolt and start shooting. And then when they were done, they'd put another one in. But that was completely integrated into the rifle. Versus, this is, I believe, a Ruger Mini 14, based off of some of the M14s and some of the other M1, not quite M1 carbines from the Second World War, where there's a fixed magazine that goes into the bottom of the gun. Otherwise, they operate exactly alike. They both, since they are rifles, have this rifle barrel. So this is a good example down the barrel of an actual, that might be a handgun barrel, but you can't really tell. That spiral grooving in there imparts spin. I'm not a sports fan, but apparently the best analogy is when the quarterback throws the football and puts spin on it, that makes it fly farther, straighter, and faster. And that same thing happens when a projectile leaves the barrel leaves a rifle barrel. It imparts spin on that projectile, and it'll go farther, straighter, and faster. Here's a picture of a modern quote-unquote assault weapon, sometimes called the modern sporting rifle, sometimes called assault weapons, sometimes just called rifles. This particular one is not a military arm. It is a civilian version. It's made to look like it. It's like buying a Hummer as opposed to a Humvee. So it is semi-automatic, which means that each time you press the trigger, only one projectile comes out. It auto-loads. That's that spring-loaded magazine here. Right? There is a magazine release that lets you change out that magazine for a new one. This particular one's got all sorts of bells and whistles on it. It's got the charging handle, which I can show you a better example when I pull the prop back out, which is it's how you make the gun ready to go. It's got sights front and rear. It's got a barrel. This has got a flash hider that would make it illegal in Massachusetts. This has got an adjustable buttstock, which would make it illegal in Massachusetts. This has got a pistol grip, which would make it illegal in California. Otherwise, this piece of metal here, interestingly, that's the firearm. Everything else is accessory to the firearm. This piece of metal is what the ATF puts a serial number, or asks to have a serial number put on, and they consider as the firearm. Everything else is sort of gravy to it. So rifles can look in all sorts of different ways. So can shotguns. You've got your typical, I believe this is a pump action shotgun, which is similar to the prop that I showed you, where you have to pull this piece of wood back towards you to load a new shotgun shell into the chamber in order to be able to be ready to fire. It's got some of the same components to it. You've got your barrel, you've got a loading port, which could also be a magazine depending on the shotgun. In the case of the shotgun, the magazine is actually embedded in this tube right here underneath this wooden piece that actually charges the shotgun. It's got a trigger, it's got a manual safety, there's an ejection port that spits out the spent shotgun shell. It's got a rifle stock, and it is obviously meant to be shouldered. And then you've got your nice double barrel shotguns here, where it only holds 2 rounds. After you fire your second shot, you break it open, it pops the 2 rounds out, you put 2 more in, and you shoot some more clay pigeons, or you shoot at geese, or whatever it is that you're hunting, or whatever sport you're in. This picture right here shows sort of it's a translucent shotgun case, so you can see the balls inside if you can. I'm not sure if you can. If you can't, I can zoom that in. Shotgun shells typically have multiple projectiles inside the shell casing, right? So inside this plastic bit here are anywhere from 3 to maybe 50 small projectiles, depending on the size shot that happens to be loaded in. We're going to talk about that as well. Rifles and pistols are usually measured in something either called caliber or directly in millimeters, and that's a reference to the diameter of the barrel and the bullets that go in it. Shotguns are measured in something called gauge. The important thing is the higher the gauge, the smaller the diameter, so it's an inverse proportion. It's based on how big a round, how much a ball solid sphere of lead is that fits down that barrel, whereas rifles and pistols, measuring it in caliber or gauge, is an actual measure of the diameter of the projectile that's in the gun. And we'll talk about that at length here. Basic parts of a handgun. We're going to use words like action a lot here, and I'm going to define them in a few minutes. This is your typical cowboy gun, right? This is a single action revolver. Single action means the only thing that this trigger does is drops this hammer. Everything else is actuated some other way. The only thing the trigger does is drop the hammer. So it's single action because the trigger does one thing. A double action revolver will do 2 things. It'll advance the cylinder and drop the hammer. But a single action revolver just drops the hammer. But a basic revolver has, any handgun is going to have most of these same parts. You're going to have your barrel. That's where the bullet travels after it gets ignited. On a revolver, you have a cylinder, which is where all the ammunition is stored before it's fired, and the spent casings are actually kept until after they're fired, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A way to load it, it's a little loading gate that flips out. I don't know if I can show this to you, because I don't know if I have a prop here that lets me do that. Nope, I don't. And that's how you load new ammunition into one of these revolvers. It's got the hammer. That's the thing that actually hits the back of the cartridge and ignites the bullet's powder charge and sends it down the barrel. Got the grip, you got the trigger. Sometimes they'll have their own safeties as well. And on this particular one with the single action revolver, you get this thing called an ejector rod, which is how you get the spent shell casings out of the gun. I should be able to demo that for you in a minute. Likewise, you've got the double action revolver. This trigger does 2 things. Let me show you. And of course, I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see the screen. Stop sharing. Double action revolver looks like this. The trigger does 2 things, right? So this cylinder, and I know I'm putting this over my head, is where you put new rounds in, right? You put bullets in here. This is an airsoft replica. You close that cylinder, and on a single action revolver, you have to cock the hammer each time and press it to discharge. On a double action revolver, this trigger does two things. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, yeah, I think it's going too fast for the camera to pick up. It's advancing this cylinder to the next position here. So every time you pull the trigger, it advances the cylinder one and then drops the hammer. Advances, drops the hammer. So this trigger does two things. Advances the cylinder and drops the hammer. On the double action revolver, there's a similar sort of manual arms. You got your grip, you've got your trigger guard, you've got a hammer, you've got your barrel. This is the muzzle, which is the business end where things come out. You've got your cylinder here. And on a double action revolver, you usually have, instead of an ejector rod where you're pushing out individual rounds, oh, there he goes. You've got the ejector rod's built into the cylinder, and it pushes all the rounds out at the same time. Can you see that? I don't know if you can see that. When I push on that, and what that's doing is it's pulling all of the spent shell casings out, and they get dumped on the floor, and then you load the gun again. So double action revolver, we call that the manual of arms. That's all the pieces that make it work. So there's a number of controls on here. This one doesn't have a manual safety. It's got rear sights and front sights. And it's got a little fake compensator. Got a little fake compensator on the front. This is the cylinder release lever, which lets you pop the cylinder out and reload the gun. Trigger does what the trigger does, etc. Then you have your semi-automatic handgun, and these come in all sorts of flavors. So your semi-automatic, tell me if you can't see this, because I can't see what actually, let me put it up on the screen so I can see it. Oh no, I can see it right here. That's why we have two phones.
Looks fine, Ed.
Yeah, so the semi-automatic handgun has a number of controls on it as well, but it also has a number of common pieces. You got the barrel, so the bullet travels down the barrel, exits the muzzle, and goes down range. On the semi-automatic handgun, you've got the magazine. This is the detachable feeding device. There we go. That goes into the gun. It's got the slide, this piece right here. Right. This slide goes back and forth when the gun is operating. So every time a round goes off, there are, depending on the operation of the gun, either the pure recoil, the pure, a solid wad of lead is coming out of this, that's throwing the slide back, or there are gases that it's capturing and using those gases to operate that. Every time you press the trigger, it fires a bullet. Every time that bullet fires, it captures that kinetic energy in some way and turns it into something that throws that slide back, which in turn then loads another bullet from the magazine. But it's got, on this, this one has a hammer. Not all semi-automatic, there you go. Has a hammer, you can see that right there. That hammer drops when you press the trigger. On this one, actually this isn't a double action one, you can also have double action or single action semi-automatic handguns. So sometimes pulling this trigger will do the same thing it did on the revolver. It'll cock the gun and fire, or cock the hammer and fire the gun. But in order to load it, you have to charge it by pulling that slide back. And go back to the slide, since that's probably a little easier. There. So it's sort of the anatomy of these. Where do you go? There it is. All right. So you've got all your parts. So everything's got a barrel. Everything's got a trigger. Everything has some kind of feeding devices, whether it's a magazine or a cylinder or a tube, or in some cases simply two tubes in which to put individual rounds. Removable magazine. Sometimes they'll have safeties, sometimes they won't. This is where knowing your gun is really important, and understanding its manual of arms and having access to either a great YouTube video or its owner's manual that describes what all these switches are. Because on each one of them, they're going to be in different places. This happens to be, I believe, that's a Smith & Wesson. The replica I was just showing you is a replica of a Sig Sauer. There are Glocks. Glocks don't have safety, external safeties. They don't have some other things on them. Smith & Wessons, M&Ps don't have safeties. They've got integral safeties. We can talk about that. that's the basics. All guns have sort of that basic sort of baseline of functionality: barrels, triggers, feeding device of some sort, sights most of the time, and then other things that operate specific features to the gun, be they magazine releases for the semi-automatic pistols, or slide releases, which let you float that slide forward, or physical safeties that prevent the gun from firing. We've got a couple of, oh, come on. Where I find out if these are still available. Where is my browser? There's my browser. Make sure this comes up. No. Nope, I did not copy for some reason. It's useful to see these in operation since we can't actually be here. So let me try that again. Control X. There it goes. One moment, please. There we go. All right, hold on. Now we got to go back to the meeting. Share. So every time, can you guys see that? The hammer drops, it drives a striker or a firing pin forward, it fires the gun throws that slide back, a little piece of metal catches that little, is it doing it again? Oh, it's going in really super slow motion. Catches a little lip on the edge of the cartridge and tosses the spent brass away. And the spring in the magazine pushes the rounds up so the next in line goes into the chamber and is ready to fire. So when the hammer drops again, it goes off. And the mechanism that is pushing that slide back is, all right, no, stop, don't go. Stop. I don't know what that is. Sorry about that. That's what a semi-automatic handgun in action looks like. That happened to be a single action semi-automatic handgun, a 1911, which is a very popular pistol. Here's a.
Since your safety is our top priority, our retailers
That's me. One second.
Shop online. Just go to
That's me.
subaruofnewengland.com. Enter your zip code to locate your Subaru retailer. And
1 second. I somehow got a commercial. That's me. I'm going to close that. Sorry about that. That was totally. And let me grab this other video of the Glock. I'm not going to spend too much time on because there we go. I don't know if you can still see my screen.
Yes.
Stop. Oh, you know what? She's going to close that. There we go. All right, and then here's some additional. Here's your Glock. The Glock has an integral striker inside it that instead of it being a hammer hitting something, it's a spring-loaded striker that's going back and forth. It's going to actually give me the, yeah, there it goes. So when you fire it, and you notice how the barrel tilted back and down? That's common in a lot of modern guns where it's assisting the loading of that next round by tipping the barrel back, providing a ramp that the next round can slide up into what they call in battery. So the gun is now in battery. There's a loaded round in the chamber and it's ready to fire. And then every time you fire it, it extracts the next one. And then this spring-loaded magazine pushes, it's constantly pushing up on the bottom of the gun, and it won't go until it's got room to, which means after it's ejected, after it's fired and ejected the the last piece of brass. And then likewise, the revolver. Let's see if it'll do the cutaway. Yeah. So the revolver's got a spring here. So when you fire it, it's pulling, it's advancing the gun, advancing the cylinder, then dropping the hammer. Just like that. Eating, share, slides. So semi-automatic pistols have slides. They have slide locks that lock that metal slide in place after usually either designed because you intended to do that, or when the magazine is empty, it lets you know that's how you know the gun is empty. They've got magazine releases so that you can remove those magazines and put a fresh magazine in to reload the gun, and then they actually have the magazines themselves. Whereas revolvers have the cylinders, a cylinder release and or loading gate, and some sort of ejector rod to get that spent brass out of the gun. Oops, not too far. We talked about single action versus double action. Single action does one thing. All it does is drop the hammer or make the firing pin engage the back of the round. Double actions do more than one thing. We've talked about passing the firearm. We're not going to do that. Talk a little bit about ammunition before we move on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the bullets look like and why they work. I'm going to talk about the types of bullets. One thing you will find both in sort of when we talk about rifles and pistols and revolvers and automatics and semi-automatics and whatever, a lot of the jargon gets pushed together. So frequently people will say, I have an automatic, which what they really mean is they have a semi-automatic handgun. The ammunition will have the word automatic attached to it sometimes. So you'll hear 45 ACP, which stands for automatic Colt pistol, which was a semi-automatic handgun, which is the 1911 that we saw a demonstration of via the video a few moments ago. Likewise with the ammo, they've got all sorts of nomenclature attached to them, but the basic components are pretty straightforward. You've got center fire ammunition and rim fire ammunition. And then you have a number of types of bullets that can be assembled with the brass cartridge to create the actual rounds that go into a gun. And they can be full metal jacket, they can be lead only, they can be something called wad cutter, they can be hollow point, they can be jacketed hollow point, they can be semi-jacketed hollow point. There's a lot of words that get attached to these things, but center fire versus rim fire of a particular caliber / diameter with a particular composition of the bullet. And any of those terms can be mixed and matched, and any of those terms could apply to any one firearm, so that's why it helps to know what you're looking at. And if you don't know what you're looking at, whoever happens to be working that firearm at the time is probably going to be happy to tell you all about it. Single action, double action, revolvers, semi-automatic, fully automatic, which are machine guns, different kinds of words used to identify different kinds of ammunition, which we'll talk about now. So, caliber identification. It's really important to put the right kind of bullet in your gun. On every modern firearm, you can find out what sort of ammunition it takes, and I don't know if you can see that, so let's embiggen this. Do that without screwing it up. I want to start from here. I'm just going to zoom. So on the barrel or on the frame of the gun, it's going to tell you what sort of ammunition the gun takes. And on modern ones, it's become somewhat standardized. When in doubt, ask somebody who knows, right? But you can usually tell what sort of ammunition the firearm takes by looking at the gun itself. Even on these replicas, they have the caliber of ammunition printed on the gun. They're airsoft guns, so they all say 6mm. And it'll come in either a caliber designation, which is a point, and then usually 2 or 3 numbers afterwards. So 357 Magnum is .357. They're about 3/10 of an inch in diameter. That's what this is a measurement of. This is in tenths of an inch or hundredths of an inch or thousandths of an inch in this case. Or 9mm, which is a direct measure of the diameter of the bullet. Interestingly, your 38 Special, your 357, your 357 Magnum, your 357 SIG, your 9mm Makarov, your 9mm Parabellum, your 9mm, I forgot what the third one is, are all about the same diameter. They're all about 3/10 of an inch in diameter, a little over. And that is a European versus American designation because we like to do things in inches and everyone else likes to do them in metric. Every bullet and even shotgun shells have the same, usually have the same components. There's a case, which is this brass piece here. The case is filled with powder and it's capped with some projectile, usually lead, sometimes copper jacketed lead, sometimes steel cord with some lead around it. Sometimes some other material that's they call frangible, so it disintegrates when it hits something solid. And then a primer, and the primer is, if you ever played with those snap caps as a kid where you threw them down on the ground and they popped, a primer is made from a similar kind of contact explosive where it requires a certain amount of kinetic energy to hit it with a certain number of PSI in order for it to explode. So the primer goes in the base of the bullet, powder goes inside the cartridge, bullet goes on top. That makes a complete round of ammunition. Oh, not too far. Centerfire cartridges have the cartridge, the primer, the thing that you hit to make it explode to ignite that powder in the center of the cartridge. There are a couple different kinds. You'll never see one of these unless you get into weird military rifles. Centerfire, quote unquote, boxer primers are the standard for most centerfire ammunition. They've got a separate physical primer that's shoved into the bottom of that cartridge that ignites the powder that sends the bullet out the barrel. Rimfire cartridges are just that. If you fired your .22 rifle in Boy Scouts or as a kid, the edge of the cartridge is painted with a similar contact explosive that when it's struck by that firing pin, that ignites the powder, which sends the ignition into the cartridge, which ignites the powder and sends the bullet downrange. At this point, I usually pass around some examples of those snap caps that we were talking about earlier. I'm not sure that I can, I'm not sure it'll show up on video. I can try. Yeah, maybe this will work. Centerfire guns. Oh, you see that divot underneath my index finger?
Yeah, you mean rimfire?
Yeah, that is where the firing pin, right there, struck this dummy round. And if it were a real round of ammunition, it would have sent the bullet down range. So that is rim fire. Whereas on the center fire ones, you will see, you might not be able to see it because this camera sucks there. That gel has been indented by the firing pin of the rifle that I used to try this out on, which was a Russian military rifle. Centerfire versus rimfire. Rimfire tends to be considered less reliable because it's igniting, let me put the slides back up, it's igniting the powder from a corner and from a basically painted on ignition, whereas this is igniting the powder sort of in the middle of it all rather than relying on relying on coming in from the side, and that's a much more reliable ignition system. So centerfire cartridges are more reliable. Here's another cross-sectional view of that. Bullet, case, powder, rim, primer. These rims are different on whether or not it's a semi-automatic pistol or a revolver because this little lip here is what that slide, there's a little catch inside the gun that grabs that as the slide's going back and throws that cartridge out the gun. Here are some of the sizes. These are rimfire cartridges, 22 short, which you probably won't see much anymore, 22 long rifle, which was your typical Boy Scout type gun, something called 22 WMR, which is the Mag 22 Magnum round, something called 17 and 17 HMR. And these are all rimfire cartridges. These are all, they can be rifle or pistol cartridges. And they're very small, they're very fast, they don't go very far because they don't weigh very much. Larger projectiles, larger bullets, more powder, they go faster. These are 3 different NATO cartridges, 2 rifle and a pistol, 7.62 by 51 NATO. That's your 30 caliber, your big, that's your big rifle. Most of the American military rifles chamber this 5.56 millimeter round. And by the way, 5.56 millimeters is 0.2 of an inch. So it's the same diameter projectile as these. It's just longer and therefore heavier. And also a little, it's longer, so it's going to end up flying farther and straighter and faster. But it's also heavier, so it imparts more kinetic energy. So this is actually a bigger rifle round than this. This is the one that all the quote-unquote assault weapons usually have chambered in. And then this is your typical 9 millimeter. When somebody says they've got a 9 millimeter handgun, they're almost always talking about what they call 9 by 19. This 7.62 by 51, 5.56 by 45, 9 by 19 is the diameter and the length, right? So especially when it gets into some of these different diameter designations, there are different 7.62 by 54, 7.62 by other length cartridges, and that's not the same ammunition. So it's really important to pay an awful lot of attention to what your gun shoots so that you put the right kind of 9 millimeter in it. Because if you put 9 by 18 millimeter in a 9 by 19 millimeter gun, you're going to blow the gun up. Different kinds of projectiles. So these are all what they call ball ammunition. So they're solid lead projectiles, usually with a jacket, completely enclosed in that harder metal. That keeps the shape of the bullet longer, because when it comes out of it's pure lead, when it comes out of the end of a gun, it gets kind of blobby. It doesn't fly as far or straight or as fast. This is actually required by the Hague Conventions for military use. They're not allowed to use what they call hollow points, and hollow points are, well, they're exactly that. The end of the bullet, the end of the actual tip of the bullet is hollow. And what that hollow cavity does is it allows it to expand on impact, usually on impact with something that is squishy. So hollow point bullets do that. They're designed to stop in their target, not go through their target. Interestingly enough, most law enforcement agencies in the United States mandate the use of hollow point bullets because everybody is deathly afraid of overpenetration. Not necessarily deathly afraid of who they're shooting, just not shooting the thing behind who they're shooting. Hollow point bullets are designed to dump all that kinetic energy into their target, be it a wall, an animal, or a person. Questions before we move on from bullets? I think I saw something flash. I think I saw the chat flash. Did the chat flash?
That was me being trying to make a smart aleck remark.
Okay. So the world is your oyster, as it were, in terms of the variety of caliber. Like I said, caliber, when something, it's 22 caliber, it's 0.2 of an inch, it's 0.22 inches. When something's 9 millimeter, it's legitimately about 9 millimeters in diameter. We'll talk a little bit about the whys of the handguns, and then move to the next section where I'll do some demonstration. And that'll probably get us right up till about 5, maybe a little after. I don't expect this will go more than 5:30. So if that's a problem for anybody, let me know. So we talked at the beginning of the class about why you want this class. Some of you just want education. Some of you are actually going to go out and get the license. I would strongly encourage people to go out and get the license regardless of whether or not they plan on buying a gun, just so you have it. When you go to buy a handgun, you need to make some choices. Why are you buying the handgun? And if all you're doing is you want to have an interesting Zen experience that most of the people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts aren't going to want to hear you talk about, you might be target shooting. You might be interested in excuse me, competitions of various sorts, be they Olympics or some of the action-oriented competitions that are out there. You might want to hunt. You can indeed hunt with a handgun, but you need a special setup. Or you might be carrying a gun because, well, you're going to get a job as a security guard, or you're interested in either home defense or personal defense outside the home for concealed carry. And each gun is going to have different things associated with it. They're going to drive which gun you buy, right? So if you're targeting a plinking gun, you might end up with this Ruger Mark III. Actually, don't buy a Ruger Mark III, buy a Mark IV. The Mark IIIs are a pain in the ass to take apart. If you get into competition, I hope you're independently wealthy because these guns are very expensive. Hunting with a handgun takes some practice and some skill. And concealed carry is a whole different ball of wax. If you do get into the concealed carry world, then you're going to want to take more than just this basic class, because I'm not going to tell you much, if anything, about the whys and the wherefores of using your gun to defend yourself. Not in this class. That's a different class. I usually spend a lot more time talking about that. What I can do is, if we're almost done with the slides, which I think we are almost, I'll switch over to props and demonstration, and we can talk a little bit about those things rather than the formal material. So you'll choose the gun based on the, quote unquote, the mission that you have for the gun, and then you're going to get other stuff that's going to come with the gun, some of which you're going to have because it's required. Massachusetts requires all FFLs to sell you the gun with a lock, and the locks are going to come in a couple of different things, and I'll show you those. You might want to get a safe while you're at it. You're going to want eyes and ears, so hearing protection and eye protection. The gun stores are going to have all this. If a gun store doesn't have all this, walk out, because they probably shouldn't be in business. You're going to want a cleaning kit because you're going to want to maintain the firearm. You may or may not want these pretend snap cap so that you can do some independent practicing that is not relying on you using live ammunition. You might want some targets because not all ranges provide their targets for you. You have to take them. You might want a stapler. You might want a bag to put it all in. If you're buying a semi-automatic handgun, you're probably going to want more than one magazine, because if you're not used to loading the magazines, and I'm going to show you that, I think, in a few minutes. If you're not used to loading the magazines, it's really hard on the thumbs. So sometimes it's nice to have a couple of magazines already loaded. You take them to the range, you shoot 3 or 4 magazines. Maybe you reload them once, and then you go home. Otherwise, you're stopping between every 10 shots and reloading, and that can be tiresome. So sometimes you want to buy extra magazines. You might want that, that magazine loader. There are devices that help you load magazines, and I'll show you that. To save your thumbs, they call them thumb savers. And if you've got revolvers, you might want what they call speed loaders, although very few people do that anymore, but we can talk about that if need be. So you're going to end up with a bunch of stuff. So while you might see that $300 Smith & Wesson and say, oh, that's a pretty good price, expect to spend another $150, $200 on just crap that goes with it. And magazines are inexplicably expensive for being what they are. They're pieces of pressed sheet metal around a spring with some plastic, and they're like 40 bucks a piece. So be prepared to spend some money. It is not a poor man's sport by any stretch of the imagination. So between the cost of the class is usually over $100 bucks, then you got to give the Commonwealth another $100 bucks, and then after the privilege of spending the $200 bucks and waiting 2 months, then you go out to spend another $500 bucks. So save your pennies. Questions before we move on to more demonstration? And my screen went off. Hold on a second. I gotta turn my other screen on so I can see what I'm doing while I'm doing it. I've got this great classroom set up that I can't show anybody. All right, so we're going to talk about the firearms. We're going to talk about how to use the firearms. I'm obviously not going to discharge any firearms because I'm in an office building in Newton. So we're going to talk about loading and unloading, grip, stance, trigger control, sight picture, and sight alignment. And then I think that brings us to effectively the end. And we'll get to the end of that, and I think we'll be done. And then I can send you some of this material for your edification after the class. There also is a quiz that I will send out that I'd like you to take. And then at some point, I'm going to need to get your dates of birth. So I'll send you each, I'll get all your emails from the event and send you a secure email so you can send it back to me, or you can text it to me if you really want to. The email is probably easier because it's secure and it's encrypted. So that would be my preference, but we're going to want to do that. So let me stop sharing. Let me get the slides up on the screen. And make sure I don't miss anything. There it is. All right, so we've got loading and unloading. So for, see if you can see this. This is a standard magazine for a Smith & Wesson, something it's called a Shield. It's a compact semi-automatic pistol. You'll see there's holes down the side that you probably can't see that are numbered. It gives you an indication of how many rounds are in this magazine. This one only holds 7. The caliber is frequently printed on the bottom of the magazine so that you know that this is a 40 caliber Smith & Wesson Shield magazine that holds 7 rounds. This little piece of plastic is what they call it follower, I believe. Right, so it's the thing that's pushing up on the bottom of the round between the spring that you saw in the operation. So it's pushing the bullets up. To load a semi-automatic handgun, the bullets really only go in one way. So this happens to be the front. This happens to be the back. Almost all the magazines are going to look a lot just like this, right? There's a little piece of plastic in the middle. It might be orange, it might be black, it might be yellow, it might be any other color. You push down on that, you can see this bit in the back. That's meant to catch the back of the bullet. So you take the bullet, the cartridge, and you press down and back, and it slides into place. And now if you can see that, at back, and this is a really great camera, but it just sucks for close-up work. Right, and then you take the next one, and this is where it gets, you need some finger strength, and I can't do that one-handed, and I can't do that with my left hand. Some finger strength, you press in and slide back, and it slides back. Right, press in, slides back. The device, where did it go? That they call it the thumb saver, and it may not work for this magazine because it's meant for a bigger magazine. There's a little lip that pushes down for you, and then you just slide the bullet in on top. But the first time I started shooting in a long time, probably almost 20 years ago, I had absolutely no hand strength, and I needed hand strength. So that, just like that. You can see they only go in once, and it gets harder as you go down there. And there's, you can't really see it because the camera sucks. Let me see if I can turn the light on. No, that made it worse. There's an indicator that says I've got 6 rounds in it because I can still see an empty spot next to the 7. And now it's got 7 rounds in it, and it's ready to go in the gun. So we're going to pretend that's this, and then this is a real gun. So then you take that loaded magazine, you slide it into the bottom, and I usually give it a tap. You're going to hear a click where it's clicking in place, and then it won't fall out. And now that gun is ready to be used, right? Let me up here. So that's loading. And then to unload the gun, there's a little button right here, it's the magazine release, that you press in, and that releases the magazine, and you take that out. Question, do you think this gun is unloaded?
No, it is not.
I don't know. This is the short answer. It may be, it may not be. The only way to be sure that this gun is unloaded is to
Whack the slide.
Pull the slide back and lock it open. And on this particular gun, there's a little slide lock lever that you press up as you pull back. And again, some of this takes some hand strength to do all at the same time and practice. And now I can see daylight, and this gun is unloaded. Definitely unloaded. Now I can set it down and give it to someone else. That's loading and unloading a semi-automatic handgun. Loading a revolver. There's a cylinder release that pops out the cylinder, right? So now it's ready to, oh, this is reversed. There we go. See that it's empty. You just slide the cartridges into each of those holes, and then they rest down in place. And when all, on this one, 10 of them are in place, Now the gun is loaded. If I put ammunition in it. By looking at this gun, can you tell if this gun is loaded?
No.
No, it's good answer. That's the right answer. You can't tell if the gun's loaded. So there is no way to tell if the revolver is loaded unless you're got really good eyesight, and you might be able to see the sheen of the brass poking out there, except for opening the cylinder and looking and seeing that it is empty. And then you can set it down. And when you're doing this with a revolver, when you're passing it with a revolver, you're opening the cylinder and you're setting the whole gun down. There are other things to do between shooting. You can put these things called chamber flags in them. And then anybody that sort of looks over knows that that gun is not currently in a state to be used, because the chamber flag goes down into the chamber of the gun. So even on our friend, the sneaky semi-automatic, when I put the chamber flag in it, there can't be a bullet there for that flag to be inserted. These on real guns, they'll go all the way down the barrel, so it won't stick out this far. It'll be completely embedded in the gun. Again, I'm not using real guns in the class, so I can't show you that for sure, for real. So that's loading and unloading. Unloading the revolver, I think I showed you that earlier. There's this lever that pushes the spent rounds out, or even the live rounds out, right? So if you want to unload the revolver, you just do that, and all the rounds fall on the table, and you pick them up. Either they're spent or they're live, doesn't matter. So that's that. That's that. We've done the unloading, the loading. Single action revolvers, that's harder because I don't have a good prop for that. Your single action revolvers are going to have what's called a loading gate right here that flips out, and you slide the bullet in, and then you rotate the cylinder manually. Sometimes you have to rotate it with the hammer. So you see how that rotates? This happens to be a replica of a cap and ball gun. I'd have to get out a real gun, and I don't want to do that in the class. Single action revolvers, you open the loading gate, you insert each round into the cylinder, and rotate the cylinder, put the next round in, rotate the cylinder, put the next round in. Cowboy guns were meant to be basically shot for their 6 rounds and then put back in their holster or thrown away and get something else to shoot with, because you're not going to be reloading those under stress. So a lot of gunfighters had 2 guns. There's some great videos out there that show you all about single action revolvers, so I won't spend too much time on that. Unloading the same way. On the single action revolvers, there's a loading, a little rod that pushes the bullets out. So in the same way, you slide the bullet in, you rotate a little bit, and you pull that ejector rod out, and it shoves the bullets out. If we go to the range, I'll let you shoot a single action revolver first, because it's the easiest to start with. It's got the fewest moving parts, and then we'll move on to more interesting guns. We've loaded the semi, we've unloaded the semi. You can't do any hands-on. Grip. I'll talk a little bit about grip and stance and form and function. Anybody golf?
No.
No.
No, I don't either.
Apparently not.
Apparently not. Apparently golf's, well, the golf courses are open, so you can go golfing. All right, so grips. There's a good grip, is especially with actually with any firearm, but a handgun especially, since your body is taking up the slack of what would normally be the rifle buttstock. Your body plays an enormously important role in making this gun function. If you limp, if you're not holding it firm enough or straight enough, there's a good chance that as the gun operates, it's going to malfunction. So you want a good solid grip on the gun. And the way to achieve a good solid grip on the gun is you take your strong hand. If you're left-handed, it's your left hand. If you're right-handed, you're right-handed. And that gets wrapped around the gun. And what you're looking for is a lot of contact on the handgun itself. You'll notice on the back of this gun, there's this sort of indentation here, right? That's where the web between your thumb and your index finger goes. So you want to get that pressed up and on it, not over it, because then you're getting your hand in the way of the operation of the handgun. Up and under that, sometimes called a beaver tail, with as much of your strong hand in contact with the handgun as possible. right? So you'll now see that as much of my hand is touching it. I'm not crossing my fingers. I'm not doing anything weird. As much of my hand is touching as possible, right? And there's a thing that we can do to give you the right sense of grip, because it's like golf. It's like pretty much anything that requires you gripping the device. You don't want to over grip it, because if you over grip it, you're going to shake and do bad things to it. But you don't want to not grip it firmly enough, because then you won't have control over it. Because when this goes off, if it were a real gun, this big piece of metal is coming back and doing things, and it's a surprise. So if you're holding it too loosely, you're going to drop it. So a good grip is achieved by putting your hand in there, squeezing it until it starts to shake, and then relaxing until it stops shaking. And then that's exactly the right firmness and the right type of grip that you want when you're firing a handgun. Now, you can fire a handgun single-handed, or more typically, you're firing it with your second hand, with your support hand. And what you want to do with your support hand is you're replicating that. I've got as much surface area as possible, because I'm using my arm and my body to control this gun and to keep control over it, and to study it, and to make sure that when I point it at something, it's going to hit what I'm pointing it at, not at something that I'm not pointing it at. Your support hand comes up, and this is where the golf analogy comes in that apparently is lost on everybody. I had golf lessons when I was a kid, and this is the only thing I remember, where I'm getting as much of my support hand touching the gun as possible. So my thumbs are parallel and below, or maybe just the tiniest bit above the line of operation of the slide. And the palm of my hand is touching as much of this gun as possible. I'm not doing this. That's 70s cop show and it's bad. And I'm not doing this, because when I'm actuating the gun, well, one, my thumb's in the way of the operation of the slide, and two, I'm pressing on my hand and I'm possibly doing bad things to the gun. I'm doing this. And all this is doing is providing support and stability and additional contact with your body. We talked about that. Similarly for the revolvers, slightly different. So if my hand or my thumb is here, see that? And it's a real gun, and it's got a real bullet in it, and I press the trigger, what's going to happen to my thumb?
You're going to break it.
I'm probably going to hurt myself, right? So likewise, you want to keep as much of your hand below that sort of axis of operation there, right? That seam between the lower receiver and the slide as possible, to prevent, your thumb getting caught on the moving pieces. That said, it can be a little up, because you're not going to be directly sort of touching the slide. You're just going to be near it.
And do you want to show the grip where some people will reach the thumb back around the back and show them?
So I never teach that.
Well, I know. That's what I'm saying, because some people will do that and it'll get caught on the slide.
So yeah, if you take your thumb and you put it back here,
you'll see people do that.
Then your support hand is going to be above that line of operation, and you're going to get bit. With guns that don't have these beaver tails here, if you're not paying attention and you don't practice with holding that gun, you're likely to get either your main hand or your support hand too far up, and it's going to get caught as this comes back. And it's going to interrupt the operation of the gun. It's going to hurt like hell. And you might drop the gun and cause other problems.
Well, you might find, I've found, it's called slide bite, and
Right.
I found that there's a part of a person that bleeds quite a bit right there.
Yeah, no, it hurts and it bleeds a lot and it looks terrible. So don't do it. So you want the support hand to be below the thumb. You don't want to be crossing the thumbs, and you certainly don't want to be doing this.
Thank you.
Revolvers, similar. On the revolver, you don't have that convenient beaver tail, although on some of them, on this particular one, there's a nice flat spot here so you can see where your hand's supposed to, where your thumb, where the web of your, between your thumb and your index finger is supposed to go. Some of them are completely smooth. I don't think this one. Some of them, they're completely smooth. So this is going to be a fit for you. But if you'll see here, there's a little bit of sort of semicircular metal here, right? You want the web of your thumb to sort of not go over that. Now, you don't have the same problem you do with semi-automatic pistols where you're not going to get bit by the hammer, but you are going to do funny things to the gun. If your hand's too far up on it, you're going to tilt it up and you're not going to hit what you're aiming at. Additionally, on revolvers, they've got an additional sort of fun, be careful thing. See this gap right here? The cylinder gap right here? When the cartridge ignites and sends the bullet downrange, gases escape from here. So when you're shooting a revolver, you don't want your finger, you don't want any part of your body in front of this. So when you're shooting the revolver, and I don't even think I can do that on this gun, if your hands were big enough that your finger was like this, you're going to end up burning the crap out of your hand, and in larger framed revolvers, maybe even taking part of your finger off because of the expulsion of gases that are coming out here. So with